And now it's an honor to introduce someone I have come to greatly admire and whose down-to-earth and helpful nature are so appreciated. Monica Hutt has worked in state government since 2005. Throughout that time, she has held multiple positions in the Agency of Human Services. From 2015 through 2021, Monica was the Commissioner for the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living. Currently, she's working in the Governor's Office as the Chief Prevention Officer for Vermont and as a Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Phil Scott. Here to deliver a message from Governor Scott, please welcome Monica Hutt.
Oh, this is very dangerous. This is all set up. Hi, everybody. It's my very great pleasure to be here today with all of you. I feel like whenever I come to Jenna's house, I learn something. So that's wonderful. You know, after spending the last actually 28 years in human services, in community and in state government, I stepped into this role as a chief prevention officer and started to learn a lot about substance use and the journey to recovery. And as many of you already know, it's a system that has its own language, its own set of acronyms, right? You have a lot to learn if you're going to talk about this appropriately and talk about it effectively. And the way that you talk about something kind of shapes the way that other people think about it. And so it's important that you get it right. And it was really important to me that I got it right. So a little over a year later in this job, I'm still learning and I'm still making a lot of mistakes and I'm still working really hard to fit the perspectives that I learned from all of you into the way that I work and the way that I talk about this. But I have to tell you that there's this one phrase that I heard really early on that that just became foundational to everything else that I thought when I thought and talked about recovery. It completely resonated with me. And it was a little bit like, you know, when something kind of hits you and all of a sudden you can't not think about it. You can't not see the world that way. And I have to be honest and say that it was something that Peter Espenshade said to me and has said many times. And that's not a surprise to all of you. You know, Peter, you know how powerful and important he is in this world. But he said this, and I was just like, I got this. I understand. He said, the opposite of addiction is connection. So just think about that. The opposite of addiction is connection. And if I can modify that just a tiny bit, the opposite of addiction is connection and community. Right? And that's really what we're here today to talk about. That paradigm made so much sense to me. In the sea of all of this other language and acronyms, this made complete sense. And it completely grounded me in the work that I've done my whole life, right? Community is the foundation. It's the cornerstone of any journey, of any life. We all need community. Right? The people, the places, the networks, whether those are folks that are in shouting distance or in calling distance or folks that you can just get to online. That's our community. And it's the people that notice if you show up. It's the people that notice if you're doing well. It's the people that notice when you're not doing that well. You know, our community holds us. They lift us up and they celebrate. And they pick us up when we fall, because the reality is that we all fall. We all need community and journey, and the journey that is recovery, which has so many twists and turns, needs it so much more. In my own family, I have sort of seen that journey play out. I've seen it play out one time really successfully because there was community engaged, and I saw it play out not successfully when there wasn't community connected and engaged. And it makes such a difference to realize that and to apply all of this learning back to my own life and the way that I can work to support the recovery work here in Vermont with the governor and across state government. The opposite of addiction is connection. The opposite of addiction is community. And today, on behalf of myself and Governor Scott, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce a family that has taken the concept of community and made it an operational reality here at Jenna's house. As we all work to support this pilot, as it grows, as it expands, as it really tests and shows what community can do in terms of recovery and supports, we take a number of monumental steps forward in our fight against the consequences of addiction and towards the possibility of recovery for all. So please join me in welcoming, with your hands together and your hearts full, Gregory and Amy, Greg and Dawn Tatro.
Thank you very much for your applause. It's pretty overwhelming, actually, but thank you. So this is my wife, Dawn. I don't know if you guys know her or not. Some of you. And my daughter-in-law, Amy. And my son, Gregory. They all have strong points to make Jenna's Promise what it is today. One of the things I wanted to start out with is recognizing some of the work that Dawn has done with people. I do believe single-handedly she saved dozens of lives. And we have a few of them here today, which is glad you're here. Kyle and Haley there, they've been huge supporters from day one. And I think Dawn had a little bit to do with that too. So that's pretty special. The other thing, I think a lot, and sometimes I come out of the shower with a new idea and Dawn's like, no, wait, I can't take anymore. But I was thinking the other day when I was driving around, and which is a wonder I've never run anybody over, but I get so deep in thought I could hit something and not know it. But one of the things that I thought about the other day was people say, oh, Greg and Dawn are doing so much here. But you know who started this? It was Jenna. And she handed us the torch. So she sacrificed her life so we could change what we see with addiction. And that's something that we're never going to forget. So she handed us the torch, this family, and our friends, and our board members, our people that work with Jenna's Promise. And I just really struck me. She just put us in this position. And I don't think any of us really like to speak up here, but here we are because of Jenna. So, but anyway, that's kind of where we're at. Gregory's going to start off with this PowerPoint, and Dawn's got a few words to say, and I think it's going to all be good.
So one of the things when I wish Keisha was still here, when she was saying about Jenna going to India and traveling, a few weeks ago, I found this vase, and this vase was broken. It was broken in many pieces. And it was from India. And Jenna had brought it home from India, but she had broken in her travels. This sat in pieces for over 5 years on the shelf. And my grandson, Eisen, said, Zinni, let's put this back together. So we took a glue gun and we put it back together. And I realized it was so true about everybody that's healing, that we put them back together. And we don't throw them away because they're broken. And how many times we throw broken things away. And I held on to this for some reason. And then I put it back together. And piece by piece, just like how we put people back together that are in addiction, piece by piece. And they're stronger. This vase is stronger. It has character. And it tells a story. And it made me think, I went home to get this during lunch because I was like, I don't know, there's a reason. And Jenna gave this to me. And I put it back together, how we put so many people, all of us put people back together and we make them whole again. We don't throw them away, even if they're broken. So that's a little. I'm sure everybody knows Jenna's story and how she was in an emergency room for some abusive relationship. And she was given 30 days of Oxycontin and with a refill. And that really started our journey. And it just kept going downhill for 6 years. As a family, we knew there was many gaps in the system. When she would come out of recovery, she would be not housing, and then there wouldn't be a job, and then there was always something or meetings. And even though we had them, they were so distant. And so, we walked that journey with her, and we learned that if we have a service with everything together, so when someone walks in the door, they can have a mat nurse, they can have a counselor, they can have meetings, they can have a recovery coach. And that was one of the reasons that we had started doing this recovery model. Jenna's promise really came out with, she was in a sober home in New Hampshire, and she said, Mom, she was my best friend, so she called me every day. But she said, Mom, can you give me some money for Paige? Because she doesn't have any money to stay at the recovery housing, because I know she can get better. And I'm like, Jenna, I can't give you money for everybody you want to save. And she said, Mom, you and I are going to raise money. And we're going to help people that didn't have the resources that I had. And I was able to go to New Hampshire for a sober house or go to a rehab out of state. And she goes, and most of all, we're going to educate people. And that was her promise. And she says, we're going to make a great team, Mom. And she goes, we can do anything when we're together. And so when we lost her, that was the promise that we wanted to carry on.
So after this struggle, and after actually connecting with many of you in this room, we have started to craft an approach that we hope can help fill the gaps that too often those with substance use disorder are faced with, essentially. And so we view these tenets here as kind of like stepping stones, kind of filling in the gaps and creating an on-ramp for people to get into what we hope is the mountaintop of long-term recovery. The first of these is recovery housing.
So with recovery housing, we have created the first level 3 housing program in the state of Vermont, and also the first place that takes women that have been trafficked. We have a very structured program, and we have a great group of people running it. It's 24-hour surveillance, and we just meet people where they are, and we come up with a plan for them for IOP, for medical, for meetings, and we get them healthcare and dental, and it's really it's a great place because we just kind of wrap them up and they don't really have to do anything. We meet people where they're at. We have created the phasing housing, which has been really important. I know that right now we just have women's housing, but we want to have men's housing, but I can't do anymore right now. Our team can't do anymore. But so the first phase one is where people go into, they come from either corrections or rehab. Some come from sober homes, and they come in and they come into our phase program because what they were doing wasn't working. And we wrap them up, and they had 30 days, which they hate, of no phone, no social media, 24-hour surveillance, someone with them. They can't go out. And they hate that structure. But during that period of time, they are doing an IOP program. And I think they grow from it. And even though they hate us at the time, right, Krista? They grow and they become stronger. And then they graduate into the second phase, and where they get their freedom and they're not sharing a room anymore. Now they have their own room. And they're still going to meetings, but they don't have 24-hour surveillance. They have a job, and they're working on what they want for the future, whether it be go back to school or just actually started working in the local businesses around here. So that's kind of cool. And then the third phase is we have apartments. So when they've proven themselves and they're stable, they go into an apartment situation, and they mow their lawn. They have to get their own groceries. They have to be responsible for their everyday budgeting and all that. But most of all, they're also starting a savings. So when they leave the apartment, they have money for a deposit on their own housing. And they also have a really good, sound, firm footing to how to manage household needs and stuff. And then we're working on the fourth phase. We're not there, but that would be helping them find an apartment and getting them into their apartment with the money that they've saved for a deposit. So it's pretty structured, but I think it works because everybody needs the structure. Instead of just saying, in 30 days, you're doing this, we gradually work them in.
One thing we learned with Jenna as well is how important having a job is to your self-confidence and long-term recovery. So one of the things we wanted to work on was creating a workforce development coordinator who was there to support our residents and help them find employers that would be good matches, connect with CCV and NVU if they wanted to take classes or try something new, as well as set up community trainings for everybody around, not just the people in our residence. We've also learned that life skills and soft skills atrophy over time. And part of a progressive workforce development is also learning those soft skills and life skills again. So you start in something that's just a few hours, it's not too stressful, and then you can move up to one of our other businesses until eventually you're able to go out to places like Copley or Smugs or MSI. And hopefully by then you have found your passion and you've found the thing that keeps you going, that gets you up in the morning and helps you with your recovery.
So as you can see, we've started a few of our own small social enterprises from an old construction guy business. Jenna's Promising Goods is a surplus shop that we started over here in the old Parker and Stearns facility. We buy goods from everywhere, Lowe's, Walmart, I don't know, they come from all over the place, and we buy them by the tractor trailer load. So in Haley, actually, one of our stars here is our assistant manager. She's really kicking it in the ass too. Doing a great job. So. But, so the truckloads come in and we sort them, we test them, we make sure they're all in working order, make sure all the pieces and parts are there. That keeps people busy. We also do scratch and dent appliances. So we have a gentleman that's been in recovery about 8 months now, and he's been with us about 7.5, but he does all the testing. He tests the refrigerators, the washers, the dryers, the stoves, you name it. So it's good work, you know, when these guys are learning a trade and they're learning how to deal with the public, and it's really very, very proud of that crew. We also started a roasting company that you guys have tried some of the coffee today, the coffee drinkers here. Andrew was the manager on that. He's over there. He's doing a good job with it. Only fired up about a month ago. So we do have one resident that helps out some, but that's going to be, as we go along, it'll get better. Coffee sales are doing well, and we just think it's going to be a thing of the future. Also, we're rebuilding a building here in the center of town. It's an old cafe that kind of went belly up, and the building really wasn't taken care of very well. So we got a few grants to help us rebuild that building. And when we get it finished, it'll have 8 beds for recovery in the upper or the upstairs. And the main floor will be a coffee shop, bakery, place for our residents to work. And we'll probably have to hire a few more people too. But that's kind of where we started when we talk about the village center. I think it does start with, it starts with a safe place to live and a safe place to work. All these work experience, this provides work experience for people. It gets them on their feet, even if it's only 2 or 3 hours the first week, and it gets them started. So, and then all the profits cycle back into the programs that, help us stay sustainable, obviously. We have also rebuilt some of the dead buildings in town that, there was no life there. You go there, it was empty. That's something I'm very proud of. This is kind of my passion as much as anything. Don works a lot more with the people on the ground, and I'm out there doing this kind of stuff. But the coffee roaster, the Divided Sky donated the coffee roaster to us. And that's the band Fish is, I don't know if you call it Fishes or Fish, but whatever. It's probably I'm stepping on somebody's toes here, but they donated the coffee roaster, the afterburner, and some of the equipment for us to make coffee. And one of the beautiful things is we were on a Zoom with Trey, and they said, well, if you ever need any help here, just let us know. And so I said to Olivia, I said, well, shoot, write them an email, see what happens. And we did. We sent it out on a Monday, and Wednesday they said, where do you want the money sent to? So one of the best things we found, Trey did a video for us at our open house, and he said, which he rambled for quite a while, but he said something really important. And that was, a nurse told him, you're not a bad person trying to get better. You're a sick person trying to get well. And that, man, I'll tell you what, that's so true. What else we got, Gregory? Am I done yet? Or?
One more slide.
So we got to have a little fun here too, So Jenna's, and then you got it up there, don't you? Yeah. Sure. So I don't need to say anything. You can just read it. No. So this is our central hub. This is the backbone. This is where it all started. We had Jenna's reception here after the funeral, and we were driving out the driveway and we saw a for sale sign. And a few days after, we thought about it today, it'd be a place where we can help people. A lot of people, we think. This is where, like I said, it's where it all started. We have meetings here. It's wonderful. It's a family meeting, which I really love. Is amazing. People can come in and just talk and throw I call it a dead skunk around your neck. They can get it off in there. And because, after a while, that dead skunk starts to stink a little bit. So, but they can get their feelings out where we can all talk about it and feel better when we're done those meetings. What am I missing here? I guess, we're doing a lot of stuff here. People come in here and do yoga and dinner, and we have this, obviously this pretty nice setup here, which is really cool. And, it's coming, but this is, Jenna used to be an altar server here, along with Gregory too. And we'd come, Dawn and I were married right here. And that was pretty special. It's 36 years ago. So. At least that's what I think anyway. So I guess she said, I don't know if I covered it all or not, but I think we did all right.
One of the things I want to, sorry, Greg, that it's, things happen for a reason. This building was $235,000. It was the same exact price as what Jenna's life insurance was. And that's just such a weird thing, the way things happen. And so it really is, Jenna did buy it, and it is her house.
Another really special thing that we think Jenna's house offers is the North Central Vermont Recovery Center and our partnership with them. Many of the people who are part of the Recovery Center are actually here today. If you guys want to stand up, they do amazing work. They operate out of the lower level of Jenna's house, and they work hard every day to reduce barriers for everybody in recovery. They have tons of paradigm shifting and exciting programs. Crystal talked a little bit about her Parents in Recovery program that she's doing that is helping people in the moment, but is also helping to break the generational cycle of substance use disorder. We also have an amazing health and wellness program that's run by Jeff. And, a lot of people are coming here with dual diagnoses and psychological struggles as well. And so, physical activity is a huge part of helping with that, as well as the recovery the progress of recovery too. Additionally, we have peer recovery coaching, like we talked about in the PowerPoint here, yoga, clay, acupuncture, writers in recovery, and a lot of other really amazing programs. And as Dad said too, up here on the top floor, we're having weekly AA, all recovery family meetings. And these are all meant to support people in the short term as well as the long-term recovery. So we're getting people from the community in here, which is so important. And we're helping them to rebuild connections. As we've heard in some of the stories today, many times, when people are struggling and connections are being burned essentially with family members. And we saw it with Jenna in our lives too. And so this is offering a place to kind of break down that stigma and bring people in to reforge connections with a new community. And this community has been amazingly supportive for that. Lastly, we have an amazing nurse practitioner and a psychotherapist as well as part of our MAP program, and also for people in the community too. And Jenna's Promise residents who come in here, and it's replacing a service that has been lost in Johnson with the retirement of the previous doctor in town. And so what we're trying to illustrate is that too often, as it says above, the road to long-term recovery can be really overwhelming. People are going back to their homes after treatment, and we also saw this with Jenna. And so they're back at the place where they were using, they're back with their old friends, and their families often can't fully grasp the depth and the struggle of being in recovery. And so without these supports, basically that road to the mountaintop can often feel very far off and very overwhelming. And so one of our goals here that we're trying to do is we're trying to aim to fill in the gaps of support here with these stepping stones and this village model, with the village holding up these stepping stones for people so they have an on-ramp onto that long-term recovery that all of us hope that everybody can get to. And so this is, some of the stepping stones that we put in place, whether it's the MAT, whether it's our cutting edge programs at the North Central Vermont Recovery Center, our partners, whether it's our phased housing, building our community ties, workforce development, and the ongoing programs that happen here, like NA and AA and the family recovery meetings too.
And the amazing thing is that our model is taking hold, and people, like everyone here, are hosting events today. Our community has shown incredible dedication and support and being behind us 100%. We've had local businesses and owners come and offer their services for free for both the residents, people in the program, as well as the community at large. And it's created a grassroots support that has gained some very influential followers like Trey Anastasio. We're also lucky enough to have major sponsors like Milton Cat and Union Bank and Casella, as well as Hool Foundation and Kittredge, some other big names that help with our funding. And we're honored to have the backing of state and federal officials as well, like Peter Welch, who came and visited us before we started construction on our cafe and looked at the plans that we were doing. Governor Scott invited us a few years ago to the state of the state, and in this last year mentioned Jenna's promise as well. Senator Patrick Leahy has said that we are a model that can be replicated across the country. We have made a relationship with Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, who also believes that this is a model that can be replicated. And what we found is that this homegrown grassroots movement can grow, and it can do a lot. And we've also found that it doesn't really matter who you go with, because Bernie Sanders and Governor Scott probably don't always agree on everything together. However, they both support us because this is a bipartisan issue. It doesn't matter who you are. This epidemic hits everybody. And everybody across the state has realized that, from Bernie Sanders and Governor Scott to our local officials to our select board. And even more important than that, we've had the support of our community, our regular everyday people who just come in and offer their help, their services, their hands, their time, whatever they can give. And it's because of them that we've been able to grow and be the group that we are today.
I got to say one thing. Can you go back on that last picture? See, now I'm a little worried about my wife in that picture. Like I said, I'm very happy 36 years. I'm not so sure.
So together, all of the people in the community, like I said, from the neighbors and family members here right in Johnson to the governor and senators in the national field, have worked to create an intricate and self-supporting system that we hope can be replicated to help create more contribution to the recovery aftercare that's needed. We are trying our best to build a new pathway, and we hope to find ways to contribute to all of the amazing work that's already being done and start something a little different.
So that's the end of the presentation part. We tried to abbreviate it a little bit because we also felt like, as kind of the hosts of this building, we want to kind of talk for a minute and speak to this moment in time that I think we are all experiencing. As you guys have looked around this room, it's hard to believe that despite an all too short window last summer, the last time many of us were all gathered together like this was in 2019 or early 2020. We have spent the last 2 years with our attention, our spotlight, to borrow a phrase from our next speaker, honed in on this crisis of the pandemic. We've spent these 2 years with society just turned upside down. And our day-to-day activities, our economy, our social lives, everyone and everything have just been experiencing what feels like near constant whiplash. Different people were affected differently, but we all had to sacrifice. We all took some sort of a hit. The game board of our lives, of the recovery movement, of the world had been flipped. And so we've all been trying to pick up the pieces these last months as we have learned to resume life in a changed world. And I know, look, there's a lot to worry about. There's much anxiety that we can all stew in collectively regarding the addiction crisis, our national and global events. But I see a glint of hope today at Jenna's house because I see a chance to play the game fresh again. And it's a new beginning after years of struggle. There's a spark of something new that can light up each and every one of us. I see this moment and I can't help but think of my grandfather and Greg's father, Gerald Tatro. You see, he stormed the beaches of Normandy, and after his own recovery from his injuries, he was at a similar spot to all of us. World War II had flipped over the game board, and after picking up the pieces, he was ready to play the game anew too. Despite the actions that he saw at home in Waterville, Vermont, he was an ordinary person in most ways. There was an exception, though. He had a mindset about him, a can-do attitude. Those of us who knew him can remember him always saying, "There's no such thing as can't." That mentality has been passed down, and I hope you can find it alive and well today at Jenna's Promise. But Gerald took that mindset, and he wanted to start just a small construction company. But that didn't stop people from telling him that he couldn't or shouldn't. When he bought his first bulldozer, his own father didn't believe in him. He said, "What are you going to do with that thing?" Well, with that thing, he could create and would create some of the earliest ski trails atop the steep slopes of Sterling Mountain at Smuggler's Notch. That thing was what brought about Gerald's calling. And he created a company that still stands today over 65 years later, as well as decades of good deeds to help his community. It's from such small moments and new beginnings that legacies are created. His legacy is forever carved into the mountain. New beginnings can ignite possibility in all of us to choose a better path, to be a better person, to recommit to something important, to help others, or to pass on what you've learned. Today's theme for this leadership conference is to work, quote, to find new ways to help Vermont's addiction epidemic. Today is meant to be a beginning, to shift that spotlight from something that has been pulling our attention back onto the world of recovery. You know what Gerald did with his moment, an ordinary man driven to support his community to help others, building the foundations of a business and work ethic that lasts to this day. Being, while not a great person of history, a good person. I ask each of you, what will you do with your moment today? This moment, what legacy will you carve into the mountaintop? What do you want people and the recovery moment to remember you by? Now is the moment we each can start crafting that answer. And I can't wait to see, and all of us can't wait to see, what you will bring forth in the days, the years to come, because there's so much talent and passion in here that it nearly lights up the room. All of us doing this important work are lucky to have you here and in this fight for a new way to help Vermont's addiction epidemic as well. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much.
Just extraordinary. Thank you. Thank you all. So you guys going to take some stuff down? Great. So, we've been talking a lot this morning about the Vermont Recovery Coach Academy. And in looking out at the crowd, I thought I saw Kelly Morrill. Kelly, where are you? There she is. And Kelly is a graduate of the first ever Vermont Recovery Coach Academy. That was probably like 13 years ago. And Kelly is also with the state of Vermont Department of Health and was the real trailblazer in creating recovery as a department within healthcare. And it was extraordinary when that first happened. Before, recovery was just sort of lumped in with treatment or with prevention, or we weren't really sure what to do with it in public health. And it's folks like Kelly and Patty and Mickey and others who were in those early academies. Back when I was ashamed to say I was in recovery, these folks were out trailblazing, literally walking down Main Street in Burlington and saying, I'm in recovery and I'm proud. And we are standing on the shoulders of those giants. And we love you and thank you for that. What a great morning. And again, how great to hear from the Tatros. And I say literally, every time I come to Johnson, there's a new exciting program or development or a new home in this recovery village. So this is where we need to go. So I am honored now to be able to introduce a keynote speaker for the conference, of whom I can genuinely say that no single writer has had a bigger impact on our work here at Recovery Vermont. You know, recovery 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, as I was saying, was just sort of coming into its own as a distinct field in healthcare. You know, there wasn't really a distinction in the public's mind between treatment and recovery. And there certainly wasn't a distinction in the field of public health between treatment and recovery. It was treatment for 28 days and then you're recovered or you're somewhere. And those of us in recovery, who call ourselves peers, have been developing some of these services and have been holding recovery up. And we hear from folks like the Tatros or folks like Monica from the governor's office really get what recovery is. So those 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it was hard for us even working in recovery to define what recovery was. It was more than abstinence. We knew that. And for some, it was abstinence, and that was totally cool. For others, it may not have been complete abstinence, and that's totally cool as well. We knew that recovery was something more. And so slowly and together, we realized that there is not a single way, there is not a single modality of recovery. So all speakers today that I've been hearing have been talking about that, and have been talking about recovery is a unique set of connections that each individual develops, often in partnership with a recovery coach. And each individual needs a bespoke set of tools and connections. And those of us working in recovery, we support those folks by exercising what I think is the highest act of love, which is listening. Folks in recovery, in their souls, know what they need as the next steps. And this sea change in the field of recovery came about, at least through us at Recovery Vermont, through the influence of Johann Hari's work around the opposite of addiction is connection. That recovery is connection. And that's sort of our unifying field theory. And it was a real eureka moment when we discovered that, Johann. Thank you for that. So just speaking for myself, I've been in recovery a long time. You know, in Knockwood, I feel really strong about my abstinence. I'm not really that worried about my abstinence after all these years. However, if we're defining recovery as connection, I don't think my recovery is all that strong. I feel like I've lost so many of the connections that are important to my life. Or worse, I feel like I've shunned so many of the connections that were important to my life. And I think in between COVID and technology and inaction and my own inaction and my own self-isolation, this has been a tough time for me. And I can't speak for others, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's been a tough time for others as well. And I'm really excited that I have my own recovery coach and mentor, who is also a graduate of the first ever Recovery Coach Academy, who gives me so much support through the act of love that is listening. And I'm really looking forward to getting back to the connections that keep my recovery strong. My kids, my friends, my love of the theater, my home. You know, we're defined by our relationships with what we love. We don't stand alone. And if we stand alone, we really don't stand a chance. So Vermont's recovery coaches, as we've been talking about all morning, are helping thousands like me get on track or stay on track to stay connected to their healthy lives as they define them. You know, we can no longer just sort of pull someone out of the stream of life and think that we've fixed them and then put them back in that stream if the waters are a little bit toxic. And there's something wrong with the ecosystem that we're all swimming in. I don't think it's the individuals that are at fault here. And we must do better. We must do better, and we will. And we've just been hearing from the Tetros that there is great hope. And there are people doing wonderful, wonderful things. And just look here in Johnson, by returning to a village model where people know each other and care about each other and support each other and are proud of themselves and their neighbors, no matter where they are. That, I'm convinced, is the secret here. So here to share some of this hope with us is Johann Hari. Johann Hari was born in Scotland. His family moved to London when he was 1. And then he went on to graduate from King's College, Cambridge, with great distinction. Johann is an award-winning journalist, including being honored by Amnesty International. He has appeared on or had his work featured in all the major media throughout the world. He's kind of a big deal. And having met him briefly backstage, he seems like an awfully nice guy as well. Most notably, Johann is known for 3 major books. The first, Chasing the Scream, that is, right up there on the top shelf of our bookshelves in the recovery community. The second, Lost Connections, bringing some really important points about connections and our overall mental health. And his most recent book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, which, as my colleagues will tell you, I cannot stop talking about that book. I really can't. It is a mind blower. And at times it can be pretty heavy. It really can. And there's some great, great beauty and hope in it as well. And any work that cites daydreaming and the reading of fiction as evidence-based practices for our culture to get better gets my vote. So thank you for that important work, Johann. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, back in Vermont, Johann Hari.
I'm really relieved because backstage we tried to put a head mic on me and I hadn't worn one since I did my TED talk. And I always have this problem when they try to put head mics on me because when I wore it for my TED talk, when the tech guy, when he put it on my head, I said to him, if you make me wear this, I'm going to feel like Madonna. And he looked at me really intensely and he said, you should always feel like Madonna. So all throughout my talk, I felt this really strong urge to just randomly sing Papa Don't Preach, which would not have worked out so well. It's really exciting to give. This is the first time I've ever given a speech during a plague, which is very exciting. And they told me that if anyone starts coughing and dies during my speech, to just ignore it. But to be fair, that was the reaction of the American government. So should be familiar to us all by now. Sorry, they told me not to make any political jokes. That's the last one, I promise. As the Tetras were speaking, I kept thinking about something. I've never written about this, and I might get some of the details wrong, but I'll get the gist of it right. A moment I think is really relevant to them, and I think relevant to everyone here. Very early in the Vietnam War, there was a group of mothers whose sons died in Vietnam, and they knew that this was a disastrous war, and that if they didn't act, lots of people were going to die, both Americans and Vietnamese people. So they set up a group called Vietnam Mothers Against the War. And they said, we need to stop this war. And it became a huge part of the anti-war movement. But very early on, they did something that all their lives they remembered as a terrible moment, a humiliation, until they discovered something completely randomly many years later. So they called for every mother who had a son who died in Vietnam to come to the White House and protest. And they went there that day, and 8 women turned up. And they stood there in the snow, and they held their signs for an hour, and they went home and cried. And even when they became really important, this was a really painful memory for them. And then totally by chance, in the 1990s, many years after the war had ended, one of these women happened to read the memoir of a man named Dr. Benjamin Spock, who the older people in the room will remember. He was one of the most popular people in the United States. He was a baby doctor. He had a radio show. He was a bit like Oprah, basically, if you imagine a kind of equivalent, right? I mean, obviously very different in some ways, but... And Dr. Spock had come out against the war in 1969. And it was a huge turning point because very few public figures had come out. He was of that stature, of that fame, of that popularity. And it was a huge turning point in the war. And in his memoir, he described something. Years before he made this decision to come out against the war, he went to the White House to be briefed on the war. They would invite kind of public figures to basically bullshit them and tell them the war was going really well. And on his way out of the briefing, he saw 8 women standing in the snow with signs saying the war was wrong. And in his heart, he knew they were right. And for years, he remembered these women, and it haunted him, this memory. And it was partly his memory of those women that made him do this brave thing in 1969 and come out against the war, which itself was a really significant moment that did in fact help turn public opinion and meant the war ended sooner. And these women realized this thing they had remembered as a moment of humiliation had in fact turned the course of history, and they would never have known. And I was thinking about that as the Tetras were speaking, and I know it's relevant to all of you. Because often we never know the ripple effects of what we do, right? There are people in Vietnam who are alive today because of what those women did, right? There are Americans who would have been sent to fight in the war, who never got sent to fight in the war, lived and went on to have good lives because of what those women and so many other people did, right? You will never know what will be the ripple effect, in many cases, of the people whose lives you save. Right? But what we should know is when you take positive action to protect people, to protect life, to end wars, and I would argue we need to end the war on drugs, and that's partly what you are doing here. You save lives of people you will never meet, whose names you will never know, and they will save the lives of other people whose names you will never know. The one guarantee is if you don't do anything, you don't create a ripple effect. But if you act, you start to create these ripple effects. I want to talk about that in relation to what we've all just been through, right? Which is, you don't need me to remind me, you don't need me to remind you, there was a global pandemic, right? And something happened in that pandemic that is not immediately obvious what the relationship between these two things are, right? So as you all know better than I do, before the pandemic, we had the highest level of overdose deaths in the history of this country. And then the pandemic hit and the overdose rate went even higher, in fact, dramatically increased, along with depression, suicide, anxiety. Now, that isn't an obvious I'd said to you 5 years ago, one day there's going to be a virus that's an airborne virus and it's going to kill lots of people, I don't think it would be obvious to go, and that will cause a really big increase in overdose deaths, right? It doesn't seem like an obvious connection. If we can understand why overdose deaths increased so dramatically during COVID, I think it helps us to understand something absolutely fundamental about addiction that you guys all know in your hearts already. And crucially, it helps us to know what we need to do next as we emerge from the pandemic, as I'm going to touch a lot of wood here, as it seems we're doing, right? So for me, this was the journey that led me to understand this. I'm going to come back to COVID, just leave that question in your minds, was very personal. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why then, because I was very small. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family. Several members of my family, we still do. And when I started working on exactly 10 years ago, weirdly, literally almost to the day, I started working on my book about addiction, Chasing the Scream. I wasn't doing any good, right? The people I loved, I was a real mixture of feelings. The people I loved who had addiction problems. Part of me was very compassionate towards them and could see they were really suffering. Part of me was really angry with them. And none of the parts of me felt like they were making any positive difference. So I wrote the book, partly because I just wanted to figure out, well, what can I do, right? So I ended up going on this big journey all over the world and meeting a crazy mixture of people, from a trans crack dealer in Brooklyn, who is one of the wisest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel, who definitely is not one of the wisest people I know. Just a crazy mixture of people all over the world, to the only country that had decriminalized all drugs. I'll talk about what happened there in a minute. And I learned a huge amount that drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The war on drugs is not what we think it is. And the alternatives to the war on drugs are not what we think they are. I want to start with that first, the thing that impelled me into this, which was trying to understand addiction. Out of all the things I learned for the book, perhaps the most shocking to me was that I had profoundly misunderstood the addiction I had seen right in front of me. So if you'd said to me 10 years ago today, what causes heroin addiction? Let's choose heroin addiction because that was close to me. I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. And I would have said, well, the clue's in the name. Obviously, heroin addiction is caused by heroin, right? We've been told this story for 100 years. That's become totally part of our common sense. It was definitely part of mine. So we think if we kidnap the next 20 people to walk past this building, and every day for a month, we injected them all with heroin 3 times a day, like a villain in a Saw movie, at the end of that month, they'd all have a problem. They'd all be addicted to heroin for a simple reason, that there are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave. So you're exposed to it for long enough, you then have a tremendous physical hunger for the chemical hooks. You want more and more of it. That's why in English we call it being hooked, right? You crave the chemical hooks. Now, it turns out that story is not wrong. Chemical hooks are real. We know exactly how much of addiction they contribute. I'll talk about it a bit later. But it turns out this is a very small part of a much bigger picture. As you will have all noticed, detox is not recovery, right? You go through detox and the hunger for the chemical hooks is gone. If that was all that was going on, detox would be all we needed for addiction treatment. And you all will have noticed that certainly isn't the case, right? So I was trying to understand, well, what is happening then? What's going on here? And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that has transformed how we think about addiction all over the world and led to incredible ripple effects. Professor Alexander said to me, this story we have in our heads that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the chemical hooks comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. If you're feeling a little bit sadistic, you can try them at home. Don't do it at home, it'd be horrible. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drug water and almost always kill itself by overdosing within a couple of weeks, right? So there you go. That's our story. The rat is exposed to the drug. It needs more and more of it until it takes so much it overdoses. But Professor Alexander looked at these experiments and he said, well, hang on a minute. You put the rat alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing to do except use these drugs, right? It doesn't have anything that makes life meaningful for rats. What would happen, he said, if we did this differently? So he built a cage he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they've got loads of friends, they can have loads of sex, they've got everything a rat could want in life. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. And of course they try both, they don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. They hardly ever use it. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from 100% almost compulsive use and overdose when they are isolated and do not have the things that make life worth living, to no compulsive use and overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living, right? This is why I remember the very first time I met Bruce, we were on the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is an area with a lot of very chaotic street addiction. And I remember leaving and sitting in this place called Pigeon Park, which is like lots of very aggressive pigeons, and sitting there, and there were lots of people with addiction problems who I'd been talking to for a few days, and trying to process Rat Park and just thinking, the opposite of addiction is connection. That's what he means, right? So it's so weird to me to hear people saying this, because whenever people say that line back to me, I always picture that moment in Pigeon Park. But what Rat Park shows us, and there's obviously a huge amount of human evidence about this that I'm going to come to, but what Rat Park shows us is the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And once you understand that, you can see why the primary response of our society to addiction is such a disaster. The overwhelming majority of the money that we spend on drug policy in this country, even still now, today, overwhelmingly, is on arresting, shaming, stigmatizing, and punishing and imprisoning people. The overwhelming majority. And sometimes people say, and the theory behind that is, well, at least the original theory, now it's kind of an autopilot, but the original theory was, well, if someone's got an addiction, you need to inflict pain and suffering on them to give them an incentive to stop. But once you understand that pain is the cause of addiction, pain is the driver of addiction, you realize sometimes people say, oh, the war on drugs doesn't work when it comes to addiction. I mean, that's true, but that's hugely understating what we're doing. It's not that it doesn't work. The war on drugs makes addiction drastically worse, right? We put barriers between people with addiction problems and reconnecting with the society. We shame them. We give them criminal records. We traumatize them more. We imprison them. Doesn't have to be this way. I went to a place that built their drug policies around the lessons that come from Rat Park. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is staggering when you think about it. And every year they tried the American way more. They arrested more people, they shamed more people, they imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse until finally the leader of the opposition and the prime minister, who were from opposing parties, got together. If you imagine Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden getting together, that'd be the equivalent. Don't picture that, it's too unpleasant. And they said, look, we can't go on like this. What are we going to do? So they decided to do something really radical, something nobody had done in the 70 years since the global war on drugs began. They said, shall we ask some scientists what to do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. João Goulão. And they said to them, they set up this panel, it was doctors, social workers, a judge, and a criminologist. And they said, you guys go away, look at all the science, take as much time as you need, and we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So the goal was to just take it completely out of politics. All the main political parties agreed. So the panel goes away. They looked at all the evidence. They took quite a lot of time, 1.5 years. They looked at Rat Park, lots of other things. And they came back and said, okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything. But, and this is the crucial next step, we're going to take all the money we currently spend on screwing people up more, arresting them, shaming them, imprisoning them. And we're going to spend all that money instead on helping them. And they began. And it's interesting, what they did is much more like Jenna's house than what we think of as traditional rehab, right? So they do some residential rehab that has real value. Biggest thing they did was a huge program of reconnection for people with addiction problems. A lot of it was housing, right? No one is going to recover from addiction when they are homeless or in insecure housing. It's extremely difficult, right? Another thing was a huge program of job creation. Say you used to be a mechanic. They go to a garage and they say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to say to every single person with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And by the time I went to Portugal, this had been in place for 13 years, it's now been in place for 20 years. And the results are undeniable. The British Journal of Criminology, who have no dog in this fight, they're just a neutral body who study the science, measured the outcomes. Addiction fell by more than 50%. Overdose deaths fell by 80%. HIV transmission among intravenous drug users fell by more than 90%. One of the ways you know this works so well is that virtually nobody in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed a guy called João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal at the time of the decriminalization. And he said what lots of people very understandably say when they hear the idea of decriminalizing all drugs. He said, this is insane, right? We'll have an explosion in drug use. We'll have an explosion in kids using drugs. We'll have an explosion in tourists coming in to use drugs. We can't do this. And when I interviewed him all those years later, he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt really ashamed now that he realized he spent so many years screwing people's lives up when he could have been helping them turn their lives around. And this is something I saw all over the world, from Uruguay to Canada to Switzerland. When you propose moving beyond the war on drugs, it's incredibly controversial and people think you're nuts, right? And then they see the change in practice. And it's not a magic bullet. They've still got problems in Portugal and every other country in the world. But the problem gets so much smaller that there becomes a really big consensus behind the change. So I want to give you an example of another place that I think speaks to a debate that you're having right now. And then I'm going to come to COVID. In the year 2000, there was a homeless man with a very serious addiction problem living on the downtown east side of Vancouver called Bud Osborne. So the downtown east side, I've mentioned it a bit, but downtown east side is a notorious part of Vancouver. If you picture like Times Square in the 70s, but a bit worse, that's basically, you're picturing it right. It was a place with a lot of homeless people with very chaotic street addictions. There are famous images from the downtown east side of people, injecting each other in the neck in public, very disturbing images. And people in Vancouver were really afraid to go there. And Bud was living in Main and Hastings, the absolute center of the downtown east side, in a dumpster there. And at that time, there was a really intense police crackdown. They had a new mayor in Vancouver named Philip Owen, who had run for office pledging to crack down on all the local addicts. And Bud's friends were just dying all around him of overdoses. And one day he was walking down the street and he bumped into someone and he was told that his old friend Margaret had died of an overdose. And this is not the language I would use, obviously, but he thought to himself, I can't just watch my friends die, all of them one by one, but I'm just a homeless junkie. What am I going to do? Right? What am I going to do? And that night, Bud had an idea. At that time, because of the police crackdown, whenever people would shoot up, they would go and hide. They would hide in dumpsters or in little crevices or abandoned houses, right? But obviously, if you're hiding and you start to overdose, no one sees you, they just find your body, right? So Bud had an idea. He gathered together a group of the homeless people who lived there. And he said, when we're not shooting up, which is most of the time, even for quite hardcore addicts, let's just agree that we'll drop a timetable and we'll go and look in the places where we know we shoot up. And if someone's overdosing, we'll call an ambulance, right? No officials, no cops or even medical people. We'll just do this, right? So they started to do it. And over the next few weeks, in fact, in the next 3 months, the death toll on the downtown east side from overdose significantly fell. And obviously that was a great thing because it meant people who would have died got to live. But it also meant the people who lived there, the homeless people with addiction problems, started to think, maybe we're not the pieces of shit everyone says we are. Maybe we can do something. So they set up a group just together in the streets called the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, VANDU. And they were like, well, what else could we do? So Bud went to the library on the downtown east side and he started reading about drug policy. And he learned that in Frankfurt in Germany, they had set up what we would now call an overdose prevention site, a place where people could go to use their drugs, be monitored by nurses, be given clean needles, be given health advice, and that this had virtually ended deaths from overdose in Frankfurt. So Bud was like, okay, that's what we need to do here in Vancouver. But there had been nothing like that in North America in 70 years since effectively the war on drugs began. But Bud was like, all right, we'll fight for it. We'll start. And they were like, well, how are we going to do that? Like I say, the mayor in Vancouver at the time, Philip Owen, how do you describe Philip Owen? He was a right-wing guy from an extremely rich family. He wasn't Trumpian, but he was, if you picture Mitt Romney, you've got a kind of picture of him like a very rich, privileged person who just didn't know anything about addiction and had used it as a kind of wedge issue and had run. In fact, he ran for office saying all the local addicts should be taken and detained at the local military base in Chilliwack and never let out. So he was not a likely person to be persuaded. But Bob was like, well, okay, we'll try. So they built a coffin and they wrote on it, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injection site? And everywhere Philip Owen went in public, he was followed by a group of addicted people carrying a coffin, right? And there's a park in Vancouver called Oppenheimer Park. And they put a cross in Oppenheimer Park overnight for every person who had died of an overdose in Vancouver. There were more than 2,000 crosses. It was the equivalent of a jumbo jet crashing in the downtown east side every year. And every time Philip Owen spoke in public, one of them asked a question and they said, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open a safe injection site? And one week, Dean Wilson, one of the members of Vandu, stood up and said, do you remember Julie, who asked you last week, who will die next, Philip Owen? It turned out to be her because you haven't done it yet. And this went on for 2 years. And the people in Vandu were starting to lose hope that they were going to get any traction. And one day, eternally to his credit, Philip Owen said, who are these people? Like, what is this? Right? He just had no idea. That he didn't understand anything about what they were saying. So he went and just met loads of the people on the downtown east side who had addiction problems. And it blew his mind. He thought they were people who'd partied too hard and indulged themselves and just, and he was talking to people who'd been prostituted when they were children and people who'd been through absolute hell. And it blew his mind. And he went to Chicago to meet the Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman, who had grown up under alcohol prohibition and was very good on drug policy. And Philip Owen came back to Vancouver and he held a press conference. And he was there, the chief of police, the coroner, Philip Owen, the mayor, and a representative of Vandu, the drug users. And he said, I am never going to have another public event where I talk about addiction without having all these guys here because they understand it much better than I do. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to open the first safe injection site in North America. We're going to have the most compassionate drug policies in North America. Things are going to change around here. And they started to build the supervised injection site. And Philip Owen's right-wing party was so horrified, they deselected him as their candidate and his political career ended. But a more kind of liberal candidate ran to be mayor and won and opened the safe injection site. And in the following 10 years, average life expectancy on the downtown east side rose by 10 years. You don't get figures like that very often in epidemiology. You only, in fact, get figures like that when a war ends, which is exactly what this was. It was the end of a war. And I went to interview Philip Owen 12 years after the opening of Insight, the safe injection site, right just around the corner from it. And he said to me, I would sacrifice my entire political career all over again for this. How often in your life do you get to save the lives of thousands of the most vulnerable people? He's a class act, Philip Owen. And not long after that, Bud Osborne, who had started this movement, I got to know Bud really well. He died. He was 62 and he'd been homeless during a drug war. It takes a toll on you. And when Bud died, they shut down the entire downtown east side where he had lived to have this memorial service for him. And there was this incredible hundreds of people there. And there were lots of people in that crowd who knew that they were alive because of what Bud had started and so many other people had followed. And shortly after that, at the time, Canada had a right-wing government led by Stephen Harper, fortunately defeated by the hottest man in the world. The Stephen Harper's government wanted to shut down this supervised injection site. They went all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court, and the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that people with addiction problems have a right to live, and therefore they couldn't shut down the injection site. That will never be taken away now. And I remember the day of Bud's memorial service thinking, you know, it's very easy in this fight to think we are up against some really powerful forces, right? The war on drugs has been in place for a long time. Bud did not sit there and think, what are we going to do then? Someone else is going to have to solve this one, right? He started where he stood. It's hard to think of a more powerless person in our culture than a homeless person with an addiction problem. Bud did not leave this problem to be solved by somebody else. When you have nothing else, you always have a voice, a human voice, to talk to other people and persuade them in a spirit of love and compassion. That's what Bud did. He persuaded more and more people. They persuaded more and more people. They have saved, at a conservative estimate, thousands of people's lives in Vancouver. In a way, you know, when we debate the supervised injection sites, the overdose prevention sites, very often it's tempting for people like me, and I'm sure lots of you, to get into the science of it, right? To go, well, every single scientific study that has ever been done of overdose prevention sites shows overwhelmingly, A, they massively reduce deaths from overdose, and B, they do not increase drug use in the wider area. Because have you ever met anyone who's going to go, hey, I hear they've opened an overdose prevention site. I think I'm going to start shooting heroin, right? No, there are no such people in the world, right? It's tempting to do that, to talk about the numbers, the statistics, the figures. But the truth is we have to talk about something much more basic. We have to say, these people deserve to live and not to die, right? In a sense, if people don't think that people with addiction problems deserve to live, if at some level at the back of their mind, they're thinking, is it such a bad thing if they die? I mean, they're so miserable anyway. That these ideas are at the back of people's minds. If we don't challenge that, I do not believe there is anyone in Vermont who, if they met Bud Osborne, would have said, I don't care if this person lives or dies. Right? So in a sense, we have to tackle a much more basic thing, which is about explaining why people deserve to live. And I would do that through another story I tell in Chasing the Scream, a story that really affected me, which I think also affects how we think about recovery. So I opened the book with the story of a woman I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard of, named Billie Holiday. And in 1939, Billie Holiday walked into a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. She wasn't allowed to walk through the front door because she was black. They made her go through the service elevator. And she went into a ballroom and she sang a song called Strange Fruit that I suspect most of you know. It's a song about lynching. It's the idea that in the South, there's a strange fruit that hangs from the trees. And as the song goes on, you realize it's the bodies of black men who've been murdered by racist mobs. Billie sang that song. And that night she was approached by some officers and she was given a warning. These officers were sent by a man named Hari Anslinger. And the officers said, in effect, stop singing this song, right? Now, for a lot of people, that seems like a bit of a weird place for me to start a book about addiction, right? They're like, what's this got to do with addiction and the war on drugs? I think it tells you so much about the war on drugs and what we need to do now. So Billie was challenged by the agents of something called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which later turned into the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And this agency was run by a man named Hari Anslinger, who was a big, bald-headed government bureaucrat. And he took over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition was ending. So the United States had a war on alcohol and alcohol won, right? And he wanted to keep his government department going. So he invented the war on drugs. He's in fact the very first person to ever use the phrase war on drugs. And he built the war on drugs, because bear in mind at this time, most drugs were not illegal in the United States. He built the war on drugs around two really intense hatreds that he had. One was a really intense hatred of Black people. He was so racist that he was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1930s, and that was quite difficult. He used the N-word so often in official memos, his own senator said he should have to resign. He was an extreme racist. And he really hated people with addiction problems. When he was a kid, he'd had some bad experiences with a neighbor who had an addiction problem. So to him, Billie Holiday was the epitome of everything he hated. She was a Black woman singing a song against racism that was really resonating with white people in particular. And she had an addiction problem. Billie Holiday grew up in in fact, it was literally the poorest part of the United States at the time. It was an area called Pigtown in Baltimore. It was the last part of the United States that didn't even have a sewage system. And one day when she was 9 years old, a man named Wilbur Rich, who was 42, came to her and said, "I've been sent by your mother to come and get you. I've got to take you to her." So she went with him and he violently raped her. He was sent to prison for 1.5 years. She was punished much more severely. They told her she was a whore. That was the word they used, that she had provoked him. She was taken from her family and sent to a convent to live in. And this was a convent where they punished wayward girls. And Billie Holiday, even at the age of 9, knew she had done nothing wrong and did not deserve this. And she rebelled against these nuns. She said, "Screw you, what have I done? This man attacked me." To punish her, they engaged in escalatingly cruel and bizarre things. This was a convent where they had bodies would be brought, because they also had a funeral parlor. And they would lock her in overnight with the dead bodies to teach her a lesson. Billie Holiday ran away and she went to find her mother. Her mother was working in a brothel in Harlem. In fact, in Harlem at the time. So Billie Holiday ran away. She found her mother and she began working, in inverted commas, alongside her mother in a brothel. So Billie Holiday is being raped by strangers for money, day after day, night after night, right? For a long time. When she's 15, the police raid the brothel. They find her. They don't tell her this is terrible. They don't arrest the clients in inverted commas. They send her to prison. They send her to the prison that was on Roosevelt Island, what's now Roosevelt Island. Billie Holiday emerges from these experiences, as you can imagine, profoundly traumatized. And she starts to anesthetize herself, initially with alcohol, then with heroin and other drugs. Also, in addition to being in terrible pain, Billie Holiday was one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. I mean, as much a genius as Picasso. She invents a whole new way of singing behind the beat. Later, people as different as Frank Sinatra and Bette Midler say they learned how to sing from Billie Holiday. And she begins to sing this song. And when Anslinger's men tell her to stop singing this song, she said, "I apologize for swearing." She said, "Fuck you, I'm an American citizen and I'll sing what I damn well please," right? And she continued to sing that song. At that point, Harry Anslinger resolved to destroy her. At that time, he hated employing Black agents, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to follow Billie Holiday everywhere. It'd be kind of obvious. So he employed an agent named Jimmy Fletcher, an incredibly good-looking man named Jimmy Fletcher, to follow her around everywhere she went. He said, gather information on her drug use, gather information on all the jazz singers' drug use. We're going to bust them all. And so Jimmy Fletcher spent 18 months following Billie Holiday everywhere. And Billie Holiday was so amazing that he fell in love with her. And his whole life, he felt really ashamed of what he did next. He went to arrest her. She was put on trial. The trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday. She said that's how it damn well felt. She was sent to prison for 18 months. She didn't sing a word in prison. But what happened next is even crueler. When she got out, at that time in most big cities, to perform anywhere where alcohol was served, you needed something called a cabaret performer's license. Anslinger made sure that Billie Holiday was not given a cabaret performer's license. Her goddaughter, Lorraine Feather, said to me, "What's the cruelest thing you can do to a person? It's to take away the thing they love." They took away singing from Billie Holiday. This, again, is what we do to people with addiction problems all over the country. We make it harder for them to find work. We make it harder for them to reconnect. In that situation, entirely predictably, Billie Holiday relapsed. And she collapsed one day, 3 blocks from where that night where she'd sung Strange Fruit. The first hospital they took her to wouldn't take her in because she had an addiction problem. The second hospital agreed to take her, but Billy was convinced that Anslinger's men were not finished with her. She said to her best friend, Maylie Duffy, on the way in, "They're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me." She wasn't wrong. She was diagnosed in the hospital with liver cancer, quite advanced liver cancer. Anslinger's men arrested her on her hospital bed. They handcuffed her to the hospital bed. They wouldn't let her friends in to see her. They wouldn't let her have her record player or her candies. In the hospital, they initially didn't give her anything for the withdrawal. And when you're very sick with liver cancer, withdrawal can kill you. Her friend Maylie Duffy insisted they give her methadone. So they gave her methadone. She began to recover a bit. And then 10 days later, Anslinger's men cut off the methadone and she died the next day. One of her friends said that she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. And I think this story about Billie Holiday is so important for so many reasons. Firstly, it tells us what the war on drugs has always been about. It has never been about solving the problems that we have, the real problems we have. A lot of it was about racism, attacking Black people, Latinos, and poor white people. And we all know, I'm sure Jenna was thankfully never interacted with the police. We all know that would not have been the case had she been poor, right? And that would have made her situation even worse. But we also see something about what it does to people with addiction problems. Whenever I think about Billy's story, I think about how many points in that story all that money they spent could have been spent to help her. When she was 9 years old and she was raped, they could have given her so much care and help to show that was not your fault, right? When they raid that brothel in Harlem when she's 15, again, she could have been helped. Instead, they sent her to prison. At every stage, this was a person who needed love, support, and help, and she got shame, stigma, and punishment instead. It didn't have to be that way. She knew it didn't have to be that way all the way through. She kept saying, at the trial, she says, all I want is someone to help me. I don't know what to do. And instead they put her in prison, which is what we are still doing now. And this conflict between Harry Anslinger and Billie Holiday, this continues today, right? Every day, all over the world, people listen to Billie Holiday and it makes them stronger and wiser. But all over the world, every day, with a handful of exceptions like Portugal, we follow the script that Harry Anslinger wrote for the war on drugs, and we make people like Billy weaker and we beat them down. And it doesn't have to be that way. I interviewed a woman called Yolanda Bavan, who is a friend of Billy's. Billy called her daughter, her adopted daughter. And Yolanda said to me, at the end of Billie Holiday's life, she thought she'd be completely forgotten. No one would remember her, that they weren't just killing her, they were killing the memory of what she'd done. And I said to Yolanda, what would you say to Billie Holiday if you could talk to her now? And she said, I'd say to her, Billie, this morning I went into Whole Foods and they were playing your songs. Nobody forgot you, baby. And I think no one will ever forget Billie Holiday's music, but we need to not forget the message of her life. And there was a lesson in it that was really challenging for me, if I'm honest, which was, in our culture, we tell one heroic story about people with addiction problems, which is that sometimes they recover. And that is indeed a really heroic story. And everyone in this room in that situation should be incredibly proud of themselves. But Billie Holiday never recovered. She died with an addiction problem. She was still an unbelievable hero. She stood up. When I think about Billie Holiday, this might sound odd, but the famous image from Tiananmen Square in China in 1989, when all these democratic protesters took over the central square in Beijing, and they literally sent in tanks and soldiers to kill them all. And there was a man who stood in front of the tank, and the tank rolled him over, and he still stood there because we don't even know that man's name, by the way. He's just known as Tank Man. The Chinese government never let us know his name. Billie Holiday was like Tank Man, right? She stands in front of this incredible force and just says, no, this is not just, this is not right. We shouldn't allow this. And she was completely right, So for me, with the people I love who have addiction problems, it helped me to think, oh, it's not the only narrative here is that you need to stop, right? Although clearly I wanted that. It's that you deserve to live even if you don't stop, right? And this profound pain and suffering that you're in, it comes from trauma, and me shouting at you ain't going to help that, right? In fact, it's going to make it worse. I want to just talk about two other things, if that's okay. I don't know how much time I've got. I'm sorry, my watch just died, the battery, sorry. I want to do a few other quick things. One is, so let's think about all this in relation to COVID, right? So why did, don't know whose they are. Why did addiction increase so much during COVID? Go back to Rat Park. The rats in the isolated cages obsessively took the drugs. The rats who had all the things that make life worth living, social connections, meaning, purpose, as far as rats have it, did not become addicted, right? Someone emailed me at the height of COVID and said, it's like we're doing an experiment as a society to see if you were right all along, right? All of our lives became like the rats in that isolated cage, right? And rats are lucky they don't have Zoom. All of our lives became much more disconnected. And in a way, everyone here knows they have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we built is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs for a long time now. 6 months before COVID struck, there was a study that found that 41% of Americans agree with this statement: no one knows me well. What is life like when no one knows you well? There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none, right? What is life like when you're going through it with nobody to depend on? We are a social species. We evolved to live in tribes. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe. We survived on the savannas of Africa because we banded together, right? We are the first humans ever to disband our tribes. And it's been catastrophe. I just want to tell you 2 stories that I think help us to think about a lot of the work that the amazing work that you're all doing. For a minute, when I start this story, you're going to think, why the hell is he telling me this? Bear with me, because it led me to really help to understand something that's relevant to Billy's story and relevant to a lot of the work you do. In the mid-1980s, there was a doctor in San Diego in California called Vincent Felitti. And he was approached by Kaiser Permanente, who are the big not-for-profit medical provider there. And they said, look, we've got a problem and we don't know what to do. We hope you can help us. And so I'm going to blow my nose, but if you argue publicly for legalizing drugs, you have to be very careful about rubbing your nose in public. So I'm going to... Sorry, I did it once on a TV show. It looks so dodgy. So the Kaiser Permanente said to him, we don't know what to do, right? And the problem they had then was about obesity. So obesity had been hugely rising. In fact, compared to now, it looks very low, but it had been hugely rising. And this obviously was hugely affecting their medical costs as a company, and it was harming people's health. So they said to him, we want to give you just budget to do blue skies research, figure out what the hell we can do, because nothing we're doing is working. They would give people diet plans. It didn't work, right? So Dr. Felitti started to work with more than 200 severely obese people who weighed more than 400 pounds, who had tried all the kind of conventional obesity treatments. And he starts to work with them, and he's just a bit of a loss, really. He's like, what do I do? And one day he had an idea that seems, and actually is in some ways, quite dumb. He asked himself, well, what would happen if really obese people just stopped eating and we gave them like vitamin shots so they didn't get scurvy or whatever? Would they burn through the fat supplies in their bodies and just, lose weight. So with a shit ton of medical supervision, they tried it. And in one sense, at first, insanely, it worked. So there's a woman in the program, I'm going to call her Julie, that's not her real name, who went from being more than 400 pounds to 138 pounds. It was mind-blowing. And Julie's family are like ringing Dr. Filidi and saying, my God, you've saved her life. This is incredible. Julie's so happy. And then one day, something happened that no one expected. Julie cracked. She went to KFC or whatever it was and started just obsessively eating. And she quickly went back to not where she'd been, but being very overweight. And Dr. Filidi said to her, called her in. He said, Julie, what happened? She looked down. She said, I don't know. He said, well, tell me about the day that you cracked. Did anything happen that day that hadn't happened on any other day? It turned out something had happened that day that had never happened to Julie before. She was in a bar and a man started to chat her up. He hit on her, not in a nasty way, in a really nice way. And Julie had felt really freaked out and she left and she went to KFC. That's when Dr. Filidi asked her something he never asked any of his patients before. He said to her, Julie, when did you start to put on weight? And she said, it was when I was 11. He said, well, did anything happen when you were 11 that didn't happen when you were 9, when you were 14, anything in particular that year? And she looked down and she said, well, that's when my grandfather started to rape me. Dr. Filidi interviewed everyone in the program. He discovered that 60% of them had put on their extreme weight gain after being sexually abused or assaulted. And it was such a weird finding that at first he's like, well, this makes no sense. Why would that be? Julie explained it to him really well. She said to him, overweight is overlooked, and that's what I need to be. Dr. Filidi realized that this thing that seems so irrational, and obviously is bad for you in one sense, being obese, was performing a profound protective function for a lot of the people in his program, that it made sense. He said he realized it's like he'd been looking at a house fire and he'd been focusing on the smoke rather than the fire. But this is a small study, right? It's 200 people. It's hard to make big conclusions. It was such a strange finding that Dr. Filidi went to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and got money to do a really big study. So he goes to them and he says, and basically what they did is everyone who came for healthcare to Kaiser Permanente in San Diego for a whole year, doesn't matter what for, headaches, broken legs, schizophrenia, anything, they were all given a questionnaire. And the questionnaire said, did any of these bad things happen to you when you were a kid? That was the first part. Things like abuse, neglect. And the second part was initially going to say, have you ever been obese or overweight? But luckily for us, at the last minute, they added loads of other things, including addiction, suicide attempts, that kind of thing. When they added up the figures, at first, they were like, there's been a mistake, add them all up again. And they came back and the figures were the same as they'd been the first time. For every category of childhood trauma you experienced, you were 2 to 4 times more likely to be obese, have an addiction problem, or have attempted suicide. But when you got into the multiple categories, the figures were crazy. If you had experienced 6 categories of childhood trauma, you were 3,100% more likely to have an addiction problem. It's staggering, right? But very often when people tell the story of Dr. Filidi's work, they end there. But actually, it's what he discovered next that is most important, and I think really connects with what you guys are doing. So when they'd done this study, they suddenly had loads of data where loads of people in San Diego had indicated to their doctors that they had been sexually abused or physically abused or neglected. So their doctors were told, don't call them in, but next time they come in with a problem, say to them something like this: I see that when you were a child, you were sexually abused. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Would you like to talk about it? And 40% of people said, no, I don't want to talk about it. But 60% of people did want to talk about it. And they wanted to talk about it on average for 5 minutes. And then it was randomly assigned. Some of them were told you can be referred to a therapist to talk about it more. What was incredible was just those 5 minutes of an authority figure saying, I'm so sorry, that should never have happened. That alone led to a really significant fall in addiction and depression. And the people who referred to a therapist had an even bigger fault. And this is part of a much bigger body of evidence. It's not the trauma that fucks you up. It's the shame about the trauma. And giving people places to release the shame and stigma releases a lot of the underlying, the equivalent of the fire that is causing this smoke, right? But of course, what we have, when you are trying to do that here, when you are doing that so successfully here, all the signals of the society are going the other way, right? So telling someone you shouldn't be ashamed of yourself in a society that's literally telling them they're criminals, it's really important to do it, but we've got to tell them as individuals, and then we've got to fight at the bigger level to stop them being given this signal by the society. And we can do that. And if any of you have any doubt that we can do that, I would tell you one last story. When I feel daunted by this, right? We're up against very powerful forces here. I think about a friend of mine named Andrew Sullivan. Some of you will know his work. Andrew's a journalist. And in 1994, Andrew was diagnosed as HIV positive at the height of the AIDS crisis, when, as far as anyone knew then, there was no hope in sight. And his best friend, Patrick, had actually just died of AIDS. And so Andrew quit his job. He thought, well, I've got a year or two to live. I'm going to do something radical. He went to a place called Provincetown in Cape Cod. And it's a great place. Some of you know it. The Provincetown is the kind of place where more than one person makes a living dressing as Ursula, the villain from The Little Mermaid, and singing songs about cunnilingus. So it's a great place. So Andrew went to Provincetown to die, right? And he decided before he died, he was going to do one last thing. He was going to write a book about a crazy utopian idea that no one had ever written a book about. And he thought, well, obviously I'll never live to see this idea put into practice. No one alive today will ever live to see this idea put into practice, but maybe someone somewhere down the line will find my book. The idea that he wrote the first book ever to argue for was gay marriage. And when I get depressed, I try to imagine going back in time to 1994 and saying to Andrew, okay, Andrew, you're not going to believe me, but 26 years from now, A, you'll be alive. That would have completely blown his mind. B, you'll be married to a man. That would have blown his mind. C, the man will be really hot. That would have pleased him. D, I'll be with you when the Supreme Court of the United States quotes this book you're writing now, when it makes it mandatory for every state in the United States to introduce gay marriage. And the next day, you'll be invited to have dinner with the president in a White House lit up with the colors of the rainbow flag to celebrate what you and other people have achieved. Oh, and by the way, that president, he's going to be black, right? It would have... It would have sounded like the most ridiculous science fiction. It'd be like me saying to all of you guys, 26 years from now, a trans president is going to invite us to smoke crack in the Oval Office with her, right? Not that we want that. Obviously, the trans president, yes, not the crack. It happened. Why did it happen? It happened because huge numbers of people appealed to the people around them in a spirit of love and compassion. That's it. That's the only thing that did it. After 2,000 years of gay people being imprisoned and beaten and shamed, that's what did it. A spirit of love and compassion and persuasion. We can do that with addiction. For 100 years now, we have been singing war songs about people with addiction problems. We should have been singing love songs to them all along. Thanks very much. Thank you. Oh, thank you. It's just longing for one of them. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Great. Thank you, Johann.
Did I talk too long? I think I talked too
No,
long.
no, love and compassion. Love and compassion. And I hope you'll stay for a few questions.
Course, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, no, perfect. Thank you.
Great. So folks are in-house are encouraged to come up to the mic to ask any questions for Johann. We also have our friends on Zoom who will be sending in questions that Vinny will be transcribing.
Hi. So thanks, Johann. I have a question from one of our online folks.
I didn't know there were any online people. Hello.
Yes.
Where are they? They're in the cloud somewhere.
Yes. So the question is, do you think that decriminalization would work in a larger country like the US?
Yeah. Should we take a few, or do you want to just do one at a time? I'm happy with whatever. Should we do someone else as well? Or I can answer that one first if you want. Great. Yes, is the answer. It's important to understand. So decriminalization is where you stop punishing people. So I think decriminalization is a partial solution. I don't think it solves the whole problem. So decriminalization is where you stop punishing users and addicts, but they still have to go to armed criminals to get their drugs, right? Which is not perfect. So I prefer legalization, which is where you open up some legal route for people to get their drugs. Now, it's important to understand legalization means different things for different drugs. I don't know the rules in Vermont, but I'm pretty sure all of you, if you wanted to, could own a dog, a monkey, or a lion. But I'm sure the rules are different, right? For a dog, you can just go into a store, right? For a monkey, you probably need a license. And for a lion, I'm sure they come and inspect your house to make sure you're not crazy, you're not Joe Exotic, right? So they're all legal, but they're legal in different ways. So I know when you say, oh, I think we should legalize heroin, people think, people picture that there would be a heroin aisle in CVS. That is not the plan, right? That's not what any of us want. Legalization, I'll give you an example of a place that legalized heroin. So Switzerland had an enormous addiction crisis, heroin addiction crisis specifically. My dad's from Switzerland. It is a really conservative country, right? My Swiss relatives make Donald Trump look like AOC, right? And yet they decided, they could just see that the harder they cracked down, the more addicts they got. So quite pragmatically, Switzerland got its first ever female president. You guys might want to try that one day, by the way. An amazing woman named Ruth Dreyfus. And Ruth explained to people, I think the solution here is to legalize heroin. And they set up a pilot. And the way it works, and it's very revealing, by the way, the clinic that was the pilot, Ruth, who's no longer the president, lives directly opposite that clinic, right? I think tells you something about her. So the way it works is if you've got a heroin addiction, you're assigned to this clinic. You're given a range of options. You can go to abstinence-based treatment, you can get methadone, or you can be assigned to this clinic. You have to go at 7 o'clock in the morning because Swiss people believe in doing things insanely early. You go in, you go into a room, you're given your heroin, medically pure heroin, by a nurse. You have to use it there partly because they don't want you to sell it on the streets and partly because they want to make sure you're okay. And then you leave and you go to your job because you're given loads of support to get housing and work. And there are lots of things about the Swiss experiment that really surprised me. So when I went there, they will give you any dose you want, except for one that will kill you. And there is never any pressure to cut back. You can stay on that program as long as you want, if you want to. But when I was there, it had been in place for 12 years. And I was interviewing the psychiatrist who runs it, a woman called Dr. Rita Mangi. And I remember her explaining to me, even though when you hear that, they'll give you as much of the drug as you want and you can stay as long as you want. What we always I thought was, well, people will just stay forever, right? Why would they ever stop? And she explained to me there were only 2 people who were still on the program who'd been there at the start 12 years before. And I said to her, well, how can that be? We're told the drug takes you over more and more. You need more and more of it. And she looked at me like I was dumb. And she said, well, we help them. And as their lives get better, they don't want to be anesthetized so much, which sounds really obvious when you hear it, but it was a hard one lesson for me. Anyone want to guess how many people have died of heroin overdoses in Switzerland in the 18 years since they legalized? 0. Far more people have died in the United States since we started talking now than have died in Switzerland in all those years. At the moment, what we do in the US is we copy the places that have disastrously failed. It's like we scanned the world for the worst failures. And we're like, let's do that, right? What I would argue is we need to start copying the places that have succeeded. Switzerland, Portugal, Uruguay, other places. So yeah, I mean, the scale of the country makes it easy. So implicit in the question was, do you think decriminalization can happen work in a big country? I mean, it can work better in a big country. It's easier to scale. It's easier to do. Vermont is pretty similar to Switzerland. As I was going around, it feels very much like Switzerland to me. Yeah, if Switzerland can do it, damn right you can do it. So yeah, it definitely can, and it has to. And I would also say to anyone who doubts it, how well do you think the war on drugs is working in a country this size, right? The one thing you can say in defense of the war on drugs is, my God, this country has given it a fair shot. The United States has spent $1 trillion. We have imprisoned millions of our fellow citizens. We have destroyed whole neighboring countries like Colombia and El Salvador. And at the end of that, we can't keep drugs out of our prisons where we pay people to walk around the wall the whole time, right? So it gives you a sense of how well that one's ever going to work, right? We tried it. We really tried, right? Pablo Escobar's son, who weirdly I've become friends with, said to me he's such an amazing person. You should invite him to your next conference. He's so great. He used to be called Pablo Escobar Jr., but for obvious reasons, he doesn't use that name anymore. He said to me, the only thing my father ever feared was the legalization of drugs. If drugs had been legal, my dad would have been a used car salesman. You would have never heard his name, right? Anyway, sorry, it was a long answer. Hello.
This microphone, I'm kind of tall, so I got to bend over like this.
Amazing.
Thank you. See, there is a solution, not just in recovery.
Exactly. Decriminalize the microphone.
Let's take the mask down. My name is Benjamin Lerner. I'm a recovery advocate and journalist. My question is, I think an interesting parallel is when you talk about the person who described the unforeseeable utopia in the book that they read in 1994. You said the funny quip about smoking crack in the future in the White House. But I think what's interesting is it's wonderful that gay marriage is a reality now, but that didn't just happen. It came as the result of a lot of advocacy, a lot of activism, a lot of grassroots politics on a lot of levels. So I guess as someone who's talked with people in countries all around the world, from the streets of Vancouver to the streets of, I think it's Zurich in Switzerland, or wherever had the first heroin clinic, what do you see as a step-by-step, of course, simplified plan that people in a place like America can take, whether it's decriminalization or it's just better job services, wraparound services, government-sponsored treatment, and partial decriminalization? What are the steps that we can take as a country to make a activism and bipartisan political movement a reality to make these things happen?
Yes, great question. Thank you. So I think in terms of political tactics, there's got to be a huge array of this is a really big policy. So there's got to be a huge array of tactics. And in a sense, I would say we need to fight it from a dozen different angles, and different people have different tastes. So some people will like lobbying their elected representatives, right? That will be the thing you're good at. Some people will be good at very direct action like Van Du. I would say the governor of your state, it's great that he praised Jenna's house. If he's still in favor of criminalizing drug users, it's grotesque hypocrisy that he's in favor of what you're doing, right? So I would say, I'm saying that I don't know if he does, right? So if that's not true, I'm not attacking him. And I know Bernie's great on this issue. I don't know enough about your governor. So I would say there may be someone here who wants to follow your governor everywhere with a coffin until he gets in line, right? And he may seem an unlikely candidate, but Philip Owen in Vancouver was the most unlikely candidate, right, for changing his mind. So some people will want to do direct action. Some people will want to lobby. Some people will do what you're doing incredibly well, which is building the alternative in practice. If there's someone who's in favor of punishing people with addiction problems, and I'm sure there are people in your community, them seeing what you're doing and learning, oh, look, she went there and she's so much better. That is so at every level, in a sense, I don't think there's one political tactic I can tell you, because we need all of them, right? We need across the board. So I would say whatever your temperament is, choose that thing. And also it really helps if we're all connected. So there's lots of groups that are fighting. I think the recovery movement is a great model for collective action, right? And I think in addition to the work the recovery movement currently does, adding a kind of politicized layer saying, also, we should never have had all these obstacles put in our way. is really powerful. So I think that organizing together, I think it's just across the board, really. We need them at every level. I know it's not very satisfying. It's always nice to say, do this one thing, but it wouldn't be truthful. There's all sorts of keys that need to go into all sorts of locks that collect. Like if we said, when my grandmothers were the age I am now, I'm 43. When my grandmothers were the age I am now, they weren't allowed to have bank accounts in their own names because they were married women. My Swiss grandmother wasn't allowed to vote. And it was legal for their husbands to rape them, as it was legal in every country in the world for a man to rape his wife, right? And then we think about, I don't want to underestimate how far we've got to go, but even the craziest wingnut now would not suggest that women shouldn't be allowed to have bank accounts, shouldn't be allowed to vote, and it should be legal for them to be raped, right? It would be completely bizarre if you heard someone say that. So we've come a long way. If you said to me, what was the one thing that did that? It wasn't one thing. Like women had to fight in their homes, in their offices, in schools, at the national level. They had to just fight everywhere across the board. And cumulatively, all those fights lead to change. So I think it's more like the fight for equality for women or liberation for women to do that. Yes, there's not one thing, but there's lots of things. And everything cumulatively that we do brings forward the day when the war ends, and that saves lives. Great. Hooray. Hello.
Hi, my name is James. I'm a nurse. I work with Savita as a spokes nurse. But I actually want to speak about your book. You bring people alive. I mean, you take your words, and to quote Peter, I think that was really well said. The highest art of love is listening. Well, you've listened a lot, and you put these people into words, onto a book that just come alive when you read them. And so you're a great speaker. You're a very great and powerful writer. Of all the stories and all the people that you've met, that you've listened to and taken in their stories, it's a personal question, but are there some that just keep haunting you other than the ones that you bring up in your presentations, but the ones that are like in your mind that sometimes speak to you at the most unexpected times?
Yeah, thank you so much for what you said. I'm really moved by that. Weirdly, there's one person in particular in that book who really haunts me. Lots of them I'm still friends with, but there's this guy I'm not friends with for reasons that will be obvious in a minute. So he was a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel. And I went to interview him in a prison in Taylor County in Texas. And it was on the way in, the guard said to me, so this guy, he beheaded about 70 people, so I can't actually leave you alone with him. And I was like, good. She says, we'll be sitting right behind you. And about 5 minutes in, I turn around, they fucking left me. Anyway, but it's fine. As you can see, I still have a head. But his story, it might sound weird because he did objectively the worst things. I mean, apart from the politicians who support the war on drugs, he did the worst thing of any of the people I met, right? To understand, I think you can all tell, addiction is really close to my heart. I actually don't think that what we do to people with addiction problems is the worst thing about the war on drugs. It's something that's even more horrific, which is when you ban drugs, as you will have noticed, they don't disappear. They're transferred from the people who used to control them, doctors and pharmacists, to armed criminal gangs. And that causes a huge amount of violence. If you want to understand why, you can do an experiment. Go into your nearest liquor store and try to steal a bottle of vodka. If they catch you, you sounded very happy at that thought. If they catch you, they'll call the cops and the cops will come and take you away. So that store doesn't need to be violent. It doesn't need to be intimidating. They've got the power of the law to uphold their property. Okay, now imagine you tried to steal a bag of coke or a bag of meth, right? Obviously, if the guy who sells that catches you, he can't call the cops, right? They would arrest him. He has to fight you. But he doesn't want to be having a fight every day. So he has to establish a reputation for being so frightening that no one's going to fuck with him, right? So the war, and he competes with his rivals through violence. The war on drugs creates a war for drugs. And if you want to know how much of that is caused by the fact that we banned it, just ask yourself, where are all the violent alcohol dealers? Does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Smirnoff in the face, right? No, Does anyone here know the name of the head of Budweiser? I don't, right? We all know who Pablo Escobar was, right? We all know who Al Capone was. Al Capone sold the same thing as the head of Budweiser, right? The only difference is it was illegal then and it's legal now. The violence ends the day you legalize, right? We don't go to war over potatoes because potatoes are legal. The law upholds the property rights. So Rosario grew up in Nuevo Laredo. And from when he was 14, the Los Zetas, one of the worst Mexican drug cartels, pumped him full of enormous amounts of drugs and sent him to go and kill people. And he killed about 70 people. It's debated how many people he killed, but it's at least 70. And he was a child soldier, right? If drugs had not been banned, who would have given Rosario machine guns to send to go and massacre people? No one, right? He might have still been a troubled kid. He would have been. But he wouldn't have, no one would have had the incentive to pump him full of drugs and send him to go and become a serial killer, right? And I think about Rosario a lot because he'll never get out of prison, obviously. In fact, he lives in solitary confinement because every time they let him mix with the general population, someone stabbed him because you would get a load of credit if you killed a Zeta. So his whole body is covered with scars from when he's been nearly killed. So he'll live the rest of his life in solitary confinement forever. He'll die, I don't know, he's quite young. I think he must be 31 now. He'll die maybe 60 years from now, having been in solitary confinement all that time. And he haunts me because what he did was terrible, but he's not an evil person. What's evil is the policy that put him in that place, right? So a lot of them haunt me, but yeah, that's the first person who came. So it was a very intense answer there. I apologize. Sorry. Hello.
Hi.
Another internet person.
Yes, another from our online audience. So this one here, they really are out there.
That sounds like a trailer for like an alien movie.
So the question is, what are your thoughts on the criminal justice system's diversion services? And if you're not familiar with that, where people caught with drugs are brought into the criminal justice system, referred to some potential supports, although with fees, and given a plan. If they follow through, the criminal charges are dropped. If you don't follow through, they go through the criminal process.
Thank you for the question. I think it's definitely better than no change at all, but it's not the answer, right? Because you're still in the framework of it's definitely better than just sending them to prison, but you're still in the framework of shame, punishment, and coercion. You know, when I worry about it, I was once on a panel. This is a horrific experience with Chris Christie, who's such an absolutely horrible person, and and you can watch it on YouTube. He started screaming and shouting at me as well. And I was like, oh, what are you going to do? Shut down London Bridge to punish me? But it was horrible. But so what they did when Chris Christie was the governor of New Jersey is he sensed that the mood was turning on addiction. Obviously, they had a huge addiction crisis in New Jersey. But he had been a huge drug warrior, right? He was responsible for huge numbers of people going to prison. So what he did is he announced, he gave a quite moving speech about how his mother could not give up smoking and died of emphysema. And he said, I've had an awakening on addiction and we're going to end the war on drugs in New Jersey, and got a huge amount of credit. What did they actually do? They took one of the prisons in New Jersey and renamed it as an addiction treatment center, but it's still a fucking prison, right? And then they made these incredibly extreme and complex conditions where maybe if you did all the right things, you could sort of get out of the prison, right? Now, not all, I don't want to act like all divergent services are that. They're absolutely not. Lots of divergent services are run by great people doing the absolute best they can in an unjust system. And I'm in favor of what they're doing. But my worry is it can become a way of effectively keeping most of the infrastructure of the war on drugs in place, but rebranding it in a way that sounds compassionate, right? Ultimately, if you are saying having an addiction problem or using drugs is a crime, you're not the answer, right? If you're saying, well, but we'll be nice if they've committed the crime and we'll give them the following 10 steps where they can get out of the criminal. We know what works. Portugal works. Switzerland works. So if it's a step along the way, you never want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. It's definitely better to have that than simply to have an aggressive war on drugs and nothing else. So if it's a step in the right direction, even a tiny step in the right direction is always worth taking. But we should be honest that it is a tiny step in an unjust war. Yeah. Sorry, that was a bit of a downer to end on. I'm sorry, but
there was a ton of hope there, Johann. We're so grateful.
Thank you all so much for doing this.
Special treat. And thank you for all your great questions and for your participation. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back with Sam Quinones. 10 minutes, everybody.
Well, I hope all of you are having a wonderful day. I know we're just so pleased to have you all here, just here in person. Over 70 organizations represented, well over 100 from around the state and all aspects of the system of care. So that's very exciting. Just a reminder, after Sam speaks, we're going to have a book signing and pictures. We're going to be setting up the book signing over here. And we'll have the step and repeat to allow pictures. So you'll proceed through the line for the books if you want them, and then the pictures, and then you can mingle. We'll have copies of Dreamland and The Least of Us for Sam, and Johann's three best-selling books will be here as well. So I hope you enjoy that. Johann and I got to spend the morning together yesterday, and we taped an episode of the Addiction Recovery Channel. It was absolutely extraordinary with my friend Ed Baker there, who's been such a force in the recovery community for nearly 4 decades. So I hope you'll watch this episode because you'll hear some of what you just heard and then a lot more. But it was really, really remarkable. And what strikes me is Johann's a really extraordinary, ordinary person. It was just such a wonderful human being. And I learned a lot, and in his true journalist style, he listened a lot, and it was just fun. So look forward to sharing that with you. It's now my honor to introduce another remarkable person to conclude today's conference. We're proud to welcome Sam Quinones back to Vermont. Sam is a Los Angeles-based journalist and has been a reporter for 35 years, including 10 years at the LA Times and 10 years as a freelancer working from Mexico. Sam has written on many topics, including immigration, gangs, drug trafficking, and the border. He's also the author of 4 acclaimed books of narrative nonfiction, including True Tales from Another Mexico, The Lynch Mob, Popsicle Kings, Chileno, and the Bronx, Antonio's Gun and Delfino's Dream, True Tales of Mexican Migration, Dreamland, The True Tale of America's Opioid Epidemic, and most recently, The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. A young adult version of Dreamland for 7th through 12th graders was also released in July of 2019. Dreamland won a National Book Critics Circle Award for the Best Nonfiction Book of 2015. It was also selected as one of the best books of 2015 by Amazon, The Daily Beast, BuzzFeed, Seattle Times, Boston Globe, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Entertainment Weekly, Audible, and in the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg Business. In 2019, Dreamland was selected as one of the best 10 true crime books of all time. In 2019, Slate.com selected Dreamland as one of the 50 best nonfiction books of the last 25 years. And the accolades go on and on. I could take all day to tell you about them. For Dreamland, Quinones also testified in the U.S. Senate's Health Committee, numerous professional conferences, and at more than 24 town hall meetings in small towns across the country. The Least of Us deepens the story of our national opioid epidemic, including now the spread of mass supplies of synthetic drugs, fentanyl and meth, namely. It also delves into the neuroscience of addiction, concluding that we live in a soup of legal substances and services whose addictiveness is ever refined by consumer product corporations. In a time when drug traffickers act like corporations and corporations like traffickers, Quinones writes, our best defense, perhaps our only defense, lies in bolstering community. Today's discussion is not just about drugs and crime or about sadness and despair. Indeed, if we allow ourselves, we could become permanently mired in our hopelessness and our loss. We would be crippled by complacency and callousness in the face of overwhelming challenges. But there is hope. And I hope that that is what you take out of today. There is hope in each other, together, that we can make a difference. In each other and in spatial places like this, where we are today, we have community and we have connection. And with each other and through each other, we have hope. That is what today is about. Please help me welcome Sam Quinones.
Thank you all. How you doing? Everybody good? Great to be in Vermont. I had some of your maple syrup this morning, man. It was really good. I had only had like the stuff that, I don't know, who makes Aunt Jemima? I can't remember. I know. Did I blow it? Is that bad? I saw these signs of gallon for $40. I was like, yeah, maybe I'd just take one. Last the rest of my lifetime. The problem is. But anyway, thank you all very much. Thank you, Daniel. Really want to say thank you and recognize how much work you put into this. I really appreciate it. So nice of you. Pardon me. And Recovery Vermont as well for the effort in putting forth and putting this thing on. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about my latest book and some stuff that I think is important, that I think we take away, that I've been interviewing and researching on, and then any, obviously any questions that you guys have. So this is the latest book, and I wanted to show it to you because I wanted to start with a story about a guy I met while I was doing it. His name is Eric Barrera. He's a husky, sweethearted guy, thick neck, former Marine. He was a social worker when I met him, going into homeless encampments, looking for vets who needed housing and drug treatment. And I met him, and we spent one evening. We've hung out several times, but the first time was at a pizza place in Pasadena, California, and he told me the following story. He said he got out of the Marines in 2000, and his Marine career was not what he kind of had hoped when he joined. It was and part of the issue was that he had some issues with depression. He gets out, and those are exacerbated by his Marine career. So he begins to use methamphetamine kind of to treat it. And the methamphetamine back then was, in his words, euphoric. He was everybody's best friend. You're just hanging out, being this groovy guy every night and hanging on mostly to his life. After several years, he still, had a job, had a car, had a girlfriend, had a house. And then one day, precisely in the year of 2009, the meth changed, radically changed. One night at his girlfriend's house, he suddenly used it. He suddenly became this raging, paranoid monster, believing that his girlfriend had men hidden in the walls. So he's stabbing the walls with butcher knives, and then the mattress and all this, looking for this man who, of course, did not exist. I met Eric Brewer, several years after that episode, he was in sober, working in those tent encampments. And by the time I met him, I was then working on this, on the book, The Least of Us. His story, as I'll explain a little bit, was crucial to the story that the book, as the book took shape. This book, I never thought I would write this book. I wrote a book called Dreamland. I'm not sure if any of you, some of you may have read it. Have you read it? Oh, my man. My man, I love you. Thank you so much for bringing a copy of the book. When I wrote Dreamland, which was a massive odyssey, my little brain was packed with like a hard drive with no more space by the end of it. It has been in this great saga, we're wandering all over America, trying to understand the opioid epidemic. And along the way, understanding too, that nobody at all wanted to talk about it. This is what I found as a reporter. I could not find people who wanted to kind of like, families in particular, everybody was ashamed, mortified, hiding. The obituaries all were fabrications. It was very much, for those of you who are old enough to remember, very much like the early days of the AIDS epidemic. Do not put HIV in my son's obituary. None of that. You remember that, right? So there's enormous silence that I encountered while I was writing the book. There were only 3 at the time. When I turned my manuscript in, there were 3 lawsuits against drug companies, only 3. And those were on hold, matter of fact. When my editor proposed the book to the publishing world in New York City, there was one publisher who stepped forward to say, yeah, I think that might be a good book, although not really sure. We'll give you a small advance, And when I finally turned the book in, if you see the subtitle to the book, it was True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic, because if I put opioid in there, no one would know what the hell I was talking about. Nobody knew what an opioid was. Now you can see the entire country. It's in headlines. It's like common parlance all of a sudden. So I finished it, and I knew that it was about one of these great issues of our time. You write about heroin, you write about opioids, you're writing about America. It was rooted, I thought, in our own destruction over many years of community, of the bonds that kind of bound us to a prosperous, healthy life. The most important bulwark, the most important defense we possess. It was rooted too, I thought, in our own desire for convenience, for easy, quick, magic bullet answer to solve all our very difficult problems. But I also will confess to you, I also thought Dreamland said all there was to say, because I was a crime reporter. I was a crime reporter. I still can consider myself a crime reporter. And I was thinking old school. And I just thought to myself, really for a while, I thought to myself, what could be worse than heroin? Right? So Dreamland comes out in 2015, and to our complete and utter amazement, in my family's house, my wife said, I thought I'd be 6 months and then on to another book. But to our complete and utter amazement, you began to see the country shift on this topic. Slowly, gradually, all of a sudden, awareness began to spread. And I was a barometer of that. I think the book was a big part of that. All of a sudden, I began to get these invitations to come speak. And I'm like, of course I'll come speak with you guys. What, because suddenly people wanted it. And after a while, every year was more. Between 2000, this is insane, really. 2015, September, the book comes out in April 15. Between September of 2015 and the time COVID hit, I did 265 speeches in ridiculous amount. I had a heart attack in the middle. Seriously, I say that it was saved by taking an elevator down 69 floors from Atlanta hotel, and as a wise and professional hotel detective called 911 and saved my life, literally. Gave me fentanyl on the way. Anyway, you begin to see people coming out of the shadows on Facebook, city council meetings, to the press. And along the way, I began to get these invitations. So I began to travel all over the country, once to Burlington, University of Vermont, Hawaii, Las Vegas, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Ohio. I mean, just on and on and on. It was a relentless thing. And I didn't dare say no, first of all, because I knew what it was like to write a book nobody read. But also I could see this big, big groundswell. There was quiet. They had no spokesman. There was no president of the association, you know? I could feel it though. The more you travel, you could feel this coming, you know? So I saw the country, or actually, you know what? I didn't see the country. I saw every, like, Hampton Inn there was to see. What I saw was Americans. It was a beautiful, beautiful thing. Every day on social media, you were hearing how polarized I was. I was traveling the country. I said, I don't see it. I don't see it. I began to make almost like a practice. It's like people would come to me with these powerfully gripping, horrible stories, and I didn't know what else to do. So I just began hugging Americans. It's an amazing thing. And I was speaking to court administrators, cops, whole conferences of federal judges, man. I was like sitting there going, what the hell is this? What am I doing here? You know, I was talking to these guys. But anyway, recovering addicts, hospital administrators, university presidents, just a remarkable thing. And along the way, the country began to change with regard to this topic. You began to see people coming out of it. But I also saw what comes after heroin, you know, fentanyl. I began to watch, really what I began to watch as I understood it, having spent 10 years in Mexico, lived 10 years in my first two books were about Mexico. Lived down there for 10 years, was this massive revolution, really change, full-on change in the trafficking world down in Mexico, away from plant-based drugs and towards synthetics. This is a radical thing because all the pioneers, long before Chapo Guzman, right? All the pioneers of the Mexican trafficking world were all farmers and ranchers. And now their grandchildren, so to speak, were now becoming chemists and world traders in chemicals. It was what I was watching was the dawning in the last few years of the great era of synthetic drugs out of Mexico, and now, of course, because of Mexico here. Why? Because it benefits traffickers, had nothing to do with users. If you are a trafficker and you don't need land anymore, sunlight, you don't need farmers, you don't need rainfall, you don't need any, you can contract the supply chain like by 80%. You can now produce drugs all year round. There's no seasons anymore. All you need now, the only thing that matters now, only one thing matters, and that is shipping ports. Through shipping ports, you get access to the world chemical markets. If you control those shipping ports, which they do, on the western side of Mexico, there's two main ones. If you look at a map, south of Arizona, 2-day drive, you get down to Manzanillo, and after that, Lázaro Cárdenas, two very, very large ports through which the entire world, but particularly China, can send massive quantities of chemicals through which you can make your drugs all year round in a lab away from the prying eyes of helicopters. Again, this is all about the benefits, and they are massive when it comes to synthetic drugs for the trafficking world. They learned these benefits from methamphetamine in the 1990s. They had using a chemical called ephedrine. I know methamphetamine is not the story it is in the rest of the country. I believe it may very soon become that story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it in case you're not quite up on what can happen. But they produced methamphetamine with one method using the drug called ephedrine, which is in Sudafed. It's a decongestant. Very easy to turn into methamphetamine. They industrialized it, making it with labs that made dozens of pounds, maybe a couple hundred pounds at a time. Meanwhile, as our opioid epidemic took root and then expanded, talk about in Dreamland, they moved into heroin. And along the way, they discovered fentanyl. Sinaloa Drug Cartel discovered in 2006, a story that I talk about on this, an underground chemist, not an amateur really, had learned how to make it in the United States, gone to prison. He was Mexican, gone to prison for many years, deported. The Sinaloa Drug Cartel hired him to make ephedrine because they thought the government was going to crack down on ephedrine. He decided, no, I don't want to make ephedrine. I want to make fentanyl. I'm smarter than all these guys. They don't know what they're doing. He makes fentanyl. They get a little bit upset. Not wise to upset the Sinaloa Drug Cartel. But he sets them down. He goes, look, fentanyl is the most profitable drug you have ever seen. Anybody has ever seen. It'll take a 50 to 1 cut. I can make 1 kilo of fentanyl, cut it 50 times. You can still sell it on the street. And that's the way they discovered. That's what they discovered was the truth. He went to prison. They lost their connection to a guy who couldn't make it. And as the years passed, eventually the Chinese got involved and their chemical companies began sending fentanyl over, but in small packages, a pound, a kilo at a time, rarely more than that. They're selling it to local dealers. And this is, you may remember, I'm not sure about here in Vermont, but in other parts of the country, begin to see these clusters of overdose deaths because the people they're selling it to have zero idea how to make this stuff. They're idiots, right? They believe the myth. The myth circulating at the time was that the best way in order to sell fentanyl, you have to mix it with a powder because it's so potent. The smallest little granules will get you high. A little bit more will kill you. But you can't sell that small amount. You have to mix it with something else and sell the whole package, a little gram or an ounce or what have you. In order to do that, these lottery-sized profits that everyone thought they were going to get are connected to how well you can mix this stuff. And the problem was they couldn't mix it well at all. They bought the idea, the myth circulating at the time, that the best way to mix your fentanyl was with a magic bullet blender. The ones bought in Target, $29.95. You remember those infomercials? And it could salsa, smoothies, all that. We have one. It's great for salsa and it's great for smoothies. Just don't mix your fentanyl with it because fentanyl's a powder. It doesn't mix. And so what you began to see because of all these bad mixes are these clusters. You remember in 2015, 16, clusters, 50, 70 overdoses at one point. Cincinnati, Huntington, West Virginia, places where already people were very aware of what opioids were. And dealers knew how to make this, what would be a major profit center for them. I can't hear you. You know what? I listened to way too much punk rock in my life, and so I can't really hear you. I'm sorry. I used to promote punk rock concerts when I was in college, and really, literally, I mean, it's like terrible. I apologize. Can I answer whatever question you had later? Thanks. How did all this get so prevalent? It's because it made sense to traffickers. It democratized drug trafficking. Now anybody could be a major kingpin. I told a story about a woman in Manchester, Vermont, Manchester, New Hampshire, pardon me, who all of a sudden was dealing 5-10 kilos of the stuff. Nobody had ever seen anybody. She was a kind of a low-level user, but because they could make this stuff in stunning quantities down in Mexico, because it's synthetic, the drugs begin to flood in, and now anybody can become a major trafficker. Anybody could be kind of kingpin, and selling these kinds of kingpin-like quantities. That's what they also, once they were caught, went to prison for kingpin-like prison sentences. They began to mix it into, because of the supply. This is a supply story, in my opinion. Because of the vast supply they were able to make, they began to mix it. Now it's like salt on food. The way we use salt on food, just throw it into everything. So first it's heroin, what is then called heroin, because now we are about a year or two away from not having any heroin up on our streets at all, nationwide. We're really almost there. And soon now, then you begin to see them mixing it into, these are local street dealers figuring this out, mixing it into cocaine. Why would you mix it? Why? The question is always, why would you mix a deadly drug, a drug that is actually magnificent? I want to say this, fentanyl is a magnificent drug when used surgically. I've had it myself, as I said. Many of you probably had, whether you knew it or not, revolutionized surgery. It did so because it's extraordinarily potent and it takes you in and out of anesthesia very quickly. That's exactly what makes it an enormous bonanza for dealers and a torment for users, because now you have to use all day long. I'm going to meet tomorrow in Portland, I hope, a guy who told me, I went from using heroin twice a day to having to use fentanyl 4 or 5 times a day because the drug, the dope withdrawals were always like right next door. They never stopped. Of course, if you're a dealer, it's magnificent. I'm getting this guy buying 4 or 5 times a day from me now. Why would you add it to cocaine? Because if you add fentanyl to cocaine, you go from a buyer getting a customer who buys from you on weekends, maybe takes 2 weeks off from the dope, all that kind of stuff, to now someone who's an opioid addict and has to buy every single day, sometimes several times a day. And once the culture in your area is made up of people who are addicted to fentanyl, a death is no longer a warning. That's an advertisement. Hey, I want to get that dope. You see this all over the country, very common to watch deaths push people to say, oh, let's get some of that. Meanwhile, I want to say something too about methamphetamine, because I understand that this is a fairly new thing for New England, but it is far from being new in the rest of the country. Certainly LA has had it for decades. But in 2000, the story that I heard from Eric Barrera is one that began to repeat itself as the methamphetamine in Mexico changed. It changed exactly that same year that Eric Barrera said he had been hit with this kind of intense paranoia and these bizarre hallucinations about where his wife or girlfriend had hidden some man. It happened because the Mexican government in 2008 limited all the importations of ephedrine, drastically curtailed, said only a few companies can possess it. And with that, the trafficking world had to shift. They had to find a new way of making methamphetamine, and new to them, they found a way that's actually old, bikers used to use in California, using a precursor called P2P, phenyl-2-propanone. Very messy, stinks, a lot of different chemicals. There's no real reason you would cook it if you had access to ephedrine, which they no longer did. They begin to cook it with P2P, but they understand that there is actually a huge benefit to P2P meth, and that has an effect right here in Vermont. And that is, you can make P2P a million different ways with all these different chemical hacks, right? You can just make all, and if the government cuts down on these chemicals, you shift to another. That means that if you have access to the chemical, as they do through these ports, you will have more, you can make methamphetamine in staggering quantities all year round. And you begin to see this really amp up in 2012, 13, 14, when the production down in Mexico begins to just explode. Begins to march across the country. They achieve, by this time, they are achieving with 2 drugs what has never been achieved before, which is the production and the covering of the United States with not just 1, but 2 drugs, meth and fentanyl. It arrives in the Midwest about 2017, 18, roughly. It's up here in these areas, according to the DEA guys I've talked to, about 2019. Certainly by COVID, it's in significant quantities, although perhaps not comparable to other places in the country. But there's another story with the meth that I think is very important to tell, never been told before, really. And that is that along the way, just like Eric Barrera, this meth is accompanied by, let me choose my words carefully, accompanied by rapid onset symptoms of schizophrenia, intense paranoia, deep hallucinations, inability to kind of function, deep inability to have any connection with anybody. It's no longer this party drug where you're everybody's best friend. Now you're deep in your own mind. Parents can no longer stand it. They kick you out very quickly. It leads to homelessness, mental illness that then leads to homelessness. And you see this march across the country like this. Eric himself was transformed into a kind of a paranoid, raging guy who had no friends. Nobody wanted to be around him. His girlfriend broke up. Mom and dad kick him out. Friends don't want to see him anymore. When he told me that story, I began to think, well, if he had that problem, and this meth is now nationwide, again, this was a few years ago, then it must be that these symptoms might then be nationwide as well. And sure enough, I began to call people in Albuquerque, Portland, rural areas, West Virginia, Southern Indiana. You began speaking with homeless outreach folks, with drug counselors, on and on. You began to hear this same story over and over. Rapid onset symptoms of meth-induced psychosis, almost impossible to differentiate from real organic mental illness. It's a remarkable thing. Along the way, though, I wanted this book to be more than just, in fact, this book started for other reasons. I just happened to notice this story emerge as I got into. One of the things I wanted to talk about in this book was the neuroscience of addiction, because I find that just so fascinating. We are in the middle of one of the greatest moments of scientific discovery in the history of humankind when it comes to neuroscience research. It's a golden age of that stuff. Learning so much about the brains. One is that, a fascinating thing is our brains have developed all these mechanisms through which to keep us alive, to warn us about imminent death. It's an amazing thing. But the remarkable thing is the drugs of abuse our brain on those drugs, those systems that help us stay alive are turned off, muted, redirected. In fact, the whole powerful impulse to stay alive now is redirected and makes us obedient to finding dope. They betray us and add to our demise. That's what dope does to our brain, seems to me. It convinces us that we can function only with it alone, and that dope equals life, even as it isolates and kills us. It's like the poster drug of our time, almost, these things. It's particularly the case when these drugs are extraordinarily prevalent and extraordinarily potent, which is the case of the two drugs I'm talking about today. Within a year or so, Eric Barrera was living in his car by himself, accompanied only by pornography on the internet, pursued by the dope, even as he was kicked out of houses by his mom and his dad and all that, alone in his car, sleeping in abandoned houses in Bakersfield. The other thing I think, though, that I found fascinating about this story is that neuroscience now shows that we can all be that addict eating from the trash. We all have the capacity, the brain chemistry, to transform us into that person eating from the trash. We can all be rendered powerless before certain substances. I smoked for 13 years, quit 9 times, relapsed 9 times till I quit. Right. So we can be primed for addiction. And in our culture today, particularly the last 30 years, unlike any culture ever in the history of mankind, we are being primed, bombarded, and prodded with addictive substances and services, all of which are legal. Sugar, chicken nuggets, fast food, nicotine, alcohol, video games, porno, gambling, casinos, and of course, social media and smartphones, all continuously refined to attack our brains in those ways that corporations have long understood. What, in particular, in the case of a lot of food and so on, they are stripped of any nutrition that might slow the absorption into the brain. So they hit our brains as fast as possible. Take chicken nuggets. Chicken nuggets are like crack. my opinion. But if you think about it, that's exactly what has happened. What has happened to fast food? They strip it of the nutrition. Well, they take the coca leaf, process it, get all those fiber out of there, unnecessary fiber, and get that cocaine powder right to you. And then a while back, years ago, when I was first starting my career, somebody had figured out if you bake cocaine with water and baking soda, it'll turn hard like a rock. You can smoke it, and boom. So it just reminds me, the story of chicken nuggets reminds me of, what is that? It's byproduct, chicken byproduct, chicken clay, they call it. It's very, very appetizing, I think. Chicken clay, it's 60% fat and salt. You dip it in the dip. It's the trifecta. It's fat, salt, and sugar, all of which our brains mightily evolved to need. So part of the book became, as I began to investigate the synthetic drug, part of the book became this idea that we are surrounded, bombarded, particularly the last 20, 30 years, in ways that no human society has ever been bombarded with so many things that are aimed at our brain chemistry to keep us using that product, keep us watching. So the Sinaloa drug cartel then takes its place along a continuum, right? Begins with Facebook, gambling casino, designers, pornographers, et cetera, pretty soon, all the way at the end, you get to Chavo Guzman and his guys down in Culiacan, Sinaloa. As Daniel said in his intro, I realized that we live in a time when traffickers behave like corporations and corporations behave like traffickers. My question then was, what can I say about what we should do? You know, I'm no different from any of you. I'm worried about the world my daughter is going to grow up in. I'm worried about the world her kids might grow up in. How do we defend ourselves against these mighty economic forces? Legal, dope, illegal, dope. I'm a journalist. I'm a true storyteller. I'm not, a sociologist. Not a public health expert, not a public elected official. Still, it occurred to me, as it had beginning with Dreamland, that our best defense, perhaps our only defense, is rebuilding, repairing, strengthening community. It's the most powerful force we possess, powerful than any drug, that necessity of being with other people. We never would have survived as a species had we not had that deep, deep need, which we just rediscovered during the pandemic, for being together. That's why we eat together, go to church, play music, storytell, play sports. All of that is because it brings us together, and our brains tell us that's good. It's like having sex, it's like eating. We need that. Good for you. That's what helps you survive. Only the problem is, in the United States, at least, in the last 30, let's say 40 years, we have decided that none of that was necessary. An entire culture bent on the idea that you can go it alone, don't worry about it. In fact, you're an admirable person for doing it on your own, or believing that you're doing it on your own. But this epidemic, beginning with the opioids, but really now into the synthetics as well, this 20 plus year saga, I believe is really teaching us things. I have to say it's a great learning moment. It's got enormous lessons for us. One of them is take control of our own accountability, our own wellness. So as I began to understand that, I stopped drinking sodas. I began walking more, particularly after my heart attack. Re-examine. It's calling on us to re-examine how we live as Americans. Right? What we eat, what we drink, how much exercise. Re-examine what we watch, where we get our news, and how we consume our news. We used to have to work for an opinion, seems to me. We used to have to read people who knew more than we did on a certain topic. Now, opinions are like fast food, stripped of any hard work, provided to us in that meme. Oh, that's my opinion right now. I just read that on Twitter. Now, pretty soon, it's like 2 days later, I'm just spouting it as if I just came up with it all on my damn own. I think it's calling on us to return to what allowed us to survive for millennia as a species. That not stop believing we could go it alone. Care for each other, spend time with each other. That's what cavemen knew to be true. Human beings die quicker in isolation. That's true now. It was true back in the caveman days. We just decided today in America in the last 30, 40 years that, we really don't need that. But that is how we still stay alive. Now we're isolated, and once again, we're killing ourselves. It means, sometimes it's the simplest, most small, low-tech stuff. It's just get out of the house. Be with other Americans. This is what I discovered as I was traveling around. It was this therapeutic thing to be around other Americans, even though they're very strange people we are. You guys were so weird. So were those folks down in, Georgia that I visited. It was this remarkable thing, and it kept me always, it was this roiling thing, kept me intellectually honest to be always having to meet people who I didn't understand or didn't know very well, didn't agree with perhaps. I think that this epidemic and now this pandemic have been trying to teach us certain things, that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable. We are only as strong as the least of us. I'm not Christian, but while writing this book, I read the Bible. I had read parts of the Bible before, but you would be blind and ignorant to have covered addiction in America and not understand the enormous importance of faith in the way people recover from drug addiction. I'd seen it far too often. And I said to myself, I'm not a journalist who sits around saying I'm going to write about the world the way I thought it was. I'm convincing others that the world's just as I thought it was when I was 25. I'll read widely. And so I began to read the Bible, and you had no guide for this book. One of the things that made it difficult had no guide for it. There was no book proposal or anything like that, as you're supposed to do, which I did not. Instead, the Gospels became my guide. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew. And what Jesus said to his disciples, which was one of the most important things in the Bible, which is, that which you do for the least of my brethren, you do for me. Jesus understood the importance of community, of that central binding idea that we could not just turn. And then all of a sudden the pandemic came along and taught us that, those meatpacking workers, they're all of a sudden essential workers. Think about that. Nobody had ever thought about that. It was a remarkable thing. All of these things began to kind of combine as I was reading this book. But I'm not a preacher, even though I may sometimes sound like one. I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller, which is why, as I set out to do this book, I really began the book with this in mind. I set out to tell the smallest, least noticed, least sexy stories of Americans involved in community repair that I could find. That was really the germination of the book. It was not about the synthetics. The synthetics came along later. After Dreamland, I said, if I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a book about how, in the smallest, least noticed ways, people are finding a way to repair the community immediately around them. Not looking for applause, certainly not thinking they're changing the world. Certainly there's no magic bullet response in any of this. People involved in helping the most vulnerable, helping the least of us. And these stories became the heart and soul of the book. So it was a flat top, tobacco chewing, fox watching sheriff in rural Ohio, deciding he had to lead in helping addicts in recovery find jobs. So he hires his town's most notorious addict, first as a janitor, then as a dispatcher, as this guy struggles with his own recovery. What I began to see was actually the stories very often were about people changing their minds. Beautiful idea. We change our minds in our daily life, constantly, right? all the time. Yet on social media and Fox News and CNN, you see people who absolutely never change their mind. On the contrary, they get more dug in and more certain that they are right, no matter what the facts. It's a bizarre kind of thing. Told a story about a woman, retiree from corporate America, who got money from her husband. When her husband died, tutoring at the jail, she kind of developed an idea that got to know some of the folks. She was a woman who told me, I'd never been in a fist fight. I didn't know anybody who had a baby mama. And now she began to tutor, and there she began to see another group. And with that money that her husband left her, she bought a $55,000 tattoo removal laser machine and formed a nonprofit and began removing tattoos that were here or here on the hands. It's a story too of how people came together to save the newly homeless, meth-addled population in the town of Clarksburg, West Virginia, from a lethal winter, using downtown churches, the churches of the middle class that had been this central part of town life. Now they were evacuated. People had been leaving that town for years and years. They were down to 15, 20 congregation of 15 or 20, all of whom were retirees. Those churches, terrified of these young people wandering around the town, screaming at demons they had no idea about, open their churches nonetheless. Open their churches as warming centers, as a polar vortex came out of the north, filled their rec rooms with air mattresses, began doing karaoke. So you have these meth-addled folks who are out there with the microphone crooning like some Vegas lounge singer singing Journey's Don't Stop Believing. It's a story of a man who secretly kept a community center open in a crumbling neighborhood that even the city thought it had closed. He just kept the key. Name is Bird. Kids would come, hey, Bird, open up this community center. The city leaders thought they'd close the thing. They didn't have any money to keep it open. Bird became the community center unto himself. Not to say that these are kind of prescriptions. I did not write a prescriptive book. I didn't want to tell prescriptive stories. It was simply the idea that as we repair these torn connections, that then solutions present themselves that would not have ordinarily done so. There are things I think we need to do. Synthetic drugs change everything. They change the idea that one day you will be ready for treatment. You will die before you ever achieve any readiness. I think, frankly, we need to be in the business of nudging people into treatment, then nurturing their desire for sobriety. I think it is calling on us, and you're seeing this in the counties where the most affected by the opioid epidemic in the Midwest, where they are changing jail. Jail has been this detrimental kind of negative thing for too long. It's never been rethought. And now you're seeing one story I tell in the book is about a county in Kentucky. Kentucky is leading this because they're the only place that elects their jailers. The jailers now have to kind of respond to the things around them. They're changing their minds. So anyway, I rushed around gathering up these stories, filled half the book with these small tales of community repair, because I thought they were kind of the heart and soul of what I was trying to say, believing that, that the medium is the message, right? That's how we best defend ourselves in a world where corporations behave like drug traffickers and drug traffickers behave like corporations. Anyway, all that is just to say that the amazing thing about this disastrous epidemic is that it is pointing us toward what I think united us as a country in many areas, at the community level, at the most local level, showing us how far we strayed from that and from what humans have always found essential. And once you get down to the local level, you burn away all that crud, that Twitter and that Facebook and CNN and Fox News. You get down to basic human interaction, which is what I was finding as I was traveling the country. It's messy. brutal sometimes. It transcends political division. You get back, though, to simple face-to-face. It's a radical idea, face-to-face interaction. It's essential to understand the synthetic dope story that I was telling briefly a little while ago. But what excited me most were these stories of community repair. People doing small stuff, not imagining that they're changing the world in some noble way. Daily work, showing up daily. That's how real social change is achieved, and it's done on the very smallest of steps, and it's the kind of change that does not bring with it unintended consequences, I believe. Figuring out how to make a community easier to live in. I got down into that, and that was the hopeful thing that I saw, that is so possible now. All across the country, there's a big push for that. The dope is pushing us to do that. And I think increasingly Americans are seeing that the way we've been living for the last 40 years is killing us off. Eric Barrera, I'll end with him, finally got sober after 3 years of using this devastating methamphetamine, turning him into this kind of raging paranoia. But he still had, the VA diagnosed him as paranoid schizophrenic. Then he stopped using meth, and all of a sudden they realized, he's not paranoid schizophrenic. He's just got some issues of depression, that's all. And they were kind of lingering, and they were still affecting his life. His girlfriend then, one day, found a stray gray pit bull wandering in traffic. She was braver than I don't think I would have opened a door for a stray pit bull in the middle of traffic, but she did. This dog hopped in, and it turned out he was this lovable, sad-eyed pooch. Looked big, looked forceful. They were going to give him up for adoption. They took him home, and he didn't eat the chihuahuas that the family was raising. They were going to give him up for adoption. Eventually couldn't keep him. And Eric said, maybe I could use him as a service dog. So he paid to have him trained. He named the dog Mundo, which is Spanish for world. He took Mundo with him then into the tent encampments. They were like this inseparable pair, kind of wandering. They did this tour a couple of times with him. The pooch moved Eric out of his depression. The dog made him take him running every day. Movement is medicine when it comes to depression. And soon Eric's depression kind of, lifted. Small, low-tech option, no pills. He began taking classes at community college, began to find it was easier to focus. The dog introduced him to all kinds of girls. Leaving meth, he found it, easier to be around people. Leaving meth, he found Mundo, he found the world. He found the small stuff. I found that to be just such a beautiful, beautiful story. Mundo, has this thick neck, short cropped hair. He's good-hearted and sweet. That's exactly what Eric looks like. They resemble each other. Each was lost, alone in a menacing world. Now they are each other's best friend and most permanent companions. Anyway, finally, after years of research and interviews and talking with folks, writing endlessly, that's, I believe, what this national saga has left me with. That the lessons of neuroscience, the opioid epidemic, the new synthetic drug era, the pandemic, the lessons of all that are really just the same. And we would be wise to heed them. And that is that we are strongest in community, as weak as our most vulnerable, and that the least of us lie within us all. Thank you all very, very much. She lived through this. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate it. And now we'll take some questions, both from the audience and from our friends online.
How you doing, man?
Doing good.
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I was looking at you going, how the hell do I know that guy? And then all of a sudden I go, oh, Ed, what am I thinking?
Yes.
You look different without the Zoom.
That's true. Without the mask too. So
Good to see
Sam
you.
Quinones, thank you so much. You're
My
a
pleasure.
beautiful man. And I was lucky enough to be part of your the study group that read your book with Mayor Weinberger's book club. And I've read both your books, and you've done so much for our community to really teach us and dedicated so much time. Now, I noticed there's like a lot of similarities between Johann and yourself, like a micro level, connection, community, individuals all coming together. But I know you also know James Raw and Tom Raw. One of your chapters was dedicated to James's son, Tom, who died of a fentanyl overdose.
Right.
James is at a whole different level.
Yes.
He's at the macro level. He's lobbying Congress to declare fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction.
Yes.
I wanted to know, what do you think about, macro approaches to this problem? Do you think there's a place for them?
Yeah, of course. And this is part of the problem we face as a country. The Mexican story, which is really what the story is about, is a complicated one. I'll say this, that the British Empire got heavily dinged by historians for pushing opium on China in the Opium Wars in the mid 1800s. To my way of thinking, I don't see Mexico as all that different. I lived down there for 10 years. I don't have any rose-colored glasses when it comes to Mexico. On the other hand, and of course, the corruption is endemic, and it's very, very difficult. And we need a kind of a collaborative approach. Again, we are trying to deal with this in isolation. We're over here blaming them; they're over there blaming us, et cetera. And it doesn't work. We, on the other hand, have allowed the traffickers make this kind of quantity of dope that has inundated our country coast to coast now, because one reason, there are many, but one of them is because our guns that are bought so easily here are smuggled down to Mexico, where they ensure the brazen, impunity that's there. So there's all these issues, and China is a whole other thing. I mean, China did crack down on the companies making fentanyl, but not on the companies making the precursors and then the pre-precursors to fentanyl. Meanwhile, their biggest customers are now the Sinaloa and the new generation cartels down in Mexico. And so it's a complicated thing. I do not believe, though, that a collaborative approach with people on both sides of the country, of this border, working towards it, which we have never had. Again, when I lived down in Mexico, I realized that we needed this kind of approach many years ago. It's the kind of approach that no American president has ever, in my lifetime, has ever moved on to be able to achieve. And I would say that there's a lot of political reasons in Mexico why they would not do it either. It's probably too long to describe. But I do believe that when you do that, you have an effect. Yeah. I would say that the trafficking world has really painted, even though they seem so, untouchable. I think to me, it feels a little bit like the Sackler family. When I was writing Dreamland, I'll wander around neighborhoods mightily affected by OxyContin, thinking to myself, there is no chance this company's ever going to be held accountable. Now look what's going on. I am stunned. I'm like, I'm just wandering around going, this is the most important grassroots movement of our time. One of the most important grassroots movements of our time. And we have paid no attention to it. And I'm talking about all those people coming out of and that's where you're seeing now 3 lawsuits when I turned Dreamland in. Now it's like, what, 2,600 or something? Again, lots of crap. And so all of that is simply to say that once problems that look so big and intractable, like calling the Sackler family / Purdue Pharma to account for the way they marketed OxyContin, I just thought there's no chance ever, they're one of the wealthiest families in America, according to Forbes. And now here they are begging to pay $6 billion. I'm stunned, and be let off of criminal prosecution. I'm not too keen on that, but this gets back to the whole idea that once you have people stepping out of the shadows, you accomplish amazing things. I can tell you again, when I was writing Dreamland, I wandered around the bottoms of Lucasville, Ohio. Lucasville, Ohio is way in the south. It's got this place that's right near the river, Scioto River, and it's a neighborhood of nothing but trailer parks and, very rough neighborhood, and everybody's strung out on Oxycontin. And I was thinking to myself, there's no chance these people are ever going to get their day in court.
Yeah.
They make the worst plaintiffs. Any defense attorney would rip them to shreds because you stole Christmas presents from your boys, right? Yeah, you're in jail on and on. And now look what we have. It's just an incredible thing. How does that happen? It happens most powerfully when people come out of the shadows, understand their own power. And that's what happened in the time after Dreamland came out. And I know it because I lived it 100%. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you,
welcome,
Sam.
man.
Thank you for your work.
Good to see you, man. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Sam.
You're welcome.
I have a question from somebody in our online
Oh, right. There's
audience.
a bunch of people online, right?
There are, yes.
Where
so
are they? How you doing?
the cameras are back that way.
there.
Yeah, they wouldn't work so well
Sorry.
catching you back there. So this is from Donald. Donald says, we have much data indicating the negative valence associated with labels like addict and substance abusers, and advocacy organizations like Friends of Recovery Vermont, thank you for the plug, Donald, and Faces and Voices of Recovery have made appreciable progress in discouraging their use.
Yeah.
The Associated Press published guidance on this for reporters 5 years ago. Was it intent or oversight? You're using this language in your latest book.
No, it's absolutely well thought out. I believe the word addict in particular is an essential word to use all the time. Okay. I'm a storyteller. How do you change people? How do you change people? Through stories. That's the only way. Happened in the gay rights issue, gay marriage. People began to see those stories next door, right? In order to tell those stories, you cannot then dilute language. First of all, let me get to something else in a minute, but so what is the option to using addict? A person who suffers from substance use disorder, 8 words for one. That story you're trying to tell about that person will be diluted. Nobody will read it. Nobody will want to know. I know because I wrote the book that did more to change stigma, in my opinion, immodestly. Right? I know what it has. As I said, before Dreamland, it was this, and then after. And I think that's because language is powerful. You do not dilute the language. In my opinion, I think that the word addict is a fine word, like migrant. The word migrant doesn't presume to say all there is about that person who's crossing that border. That person could be a bowler, could be a trucker, a poet, could be a wife abuser, could be on and on. And there's a million other aspects. I know because I wrote about Mexican immigrants for about 15 years. Deep stories. There is no chance that the word addict is simply distills all there is to know about that person's life. I know because I wrote about these people's lives in Dreamland. If you want to tell stories that end stigma, you have to use language that is powerful, that gets to the point, that is not tiptoeing. In my opinion, there is nothing stigmatizing about the word addict. Right? It's only that people feel like we're in this time where everybody takes offense. You can find something to offend everybody. Everybody can find something to be offended by. So I have thought this out long ago. And I just don't believe that it makes any sense. Try doing it. Take a story that uses the word addict and put in a person who suffers from substance use disorder every time you see the word addict. It's an crazy idea. The other word is PWAD. Who comes up with this stuff? People who use drugs or something like that. That sounds like a mutant from the underground. PWAD. He's a PWAD. The PWADs are coming for it. No, I mean, really, don't be afraid of just using forthright words. I'm a writer. Been doing this 35 years. There is not a chance I would ever use a person who suffers from something, all that kind of stuff. It's just, it gets away from what I'm trying to say, which is tell people stories about real people in a time where we now know, because neuroscience shows us this, the evidence is clear, that everybody can be an addict. Everybody can be that person eating from the trash. That's why you want to tell it that way. You want to, and so no, I have thought this out for quite a long time. And both books use the word addict, not shamefacedly, but proudly. That's just the story that I'm trying to tell. And you do not change people's minds by saying now, you know, what we've seen. Here's the other thing. What we have seen in the last, I want to say 5 years, 10, maybe more, is a whole new population willing to rethink attitudes that they've had about addiction. It's a tremendous shift. It's an amazing shift. You think things that we now take for granted, I thought could never be seen, like Lisa naloxone, Narcan, you know, syringe exchange, all that kind of stuff has become common parlance. Medically assisted treatment, method, all that, you know, this stuff has happened because people are telling the real stories about folks around them. Everybody now knows they know an addict or somebody died close to them. When I started this Dreamland, I think it was like it was a 4 to 5 to 6 degree separation between you and an overdose death. Now it's more like 2 or 3. The stories need to be told, and they need to be told with power. And so I use the word addict all the time, proudly, believing that what I'm doing by using it is actually doing far more than saying, well, I saw this person suffering from substance use disorder, and he was accompanied by another guy who was suffering from, you know, you get tangled. And so to me, I'm getting a little on my high horse a little bit on this, but I'm a writer. And to me, these are major decisions. And I thought long and hard about this over the last several years. And so no, I don't buy that idea at all. I think it's more important to tell the story. Now I can hear you.
I said Monique was the word that they were adding in with the magic bullet. But anyways, it's just common. So you say, well, I'm Nikki and I'm an addict.
There you go, Nikki.
And, you know, in NA groups, the first thing you say is, hi, I'm Nikki, I'm an addict. And that was hard for me at first because everybody around me judges me like I'm a junkie. So you write books and you get the word out, but like, what do? Do we speak to the community?
Yes. You tell your story every time you get a chance. Yes.
Okay.
No, I 100% believe that as well.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why, if you ask me, you are seeing these lawsuits. Lawsuits are just a symptom of a major change in America that's taken place over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Okay. But part of that is that you tell your story all the time, any dance until you're blue in the face, till people are like, will you shut up? You know what I mean? Just tell it and it's also the case, not just you, but your family or families affected by this. That's one of the great changes in our country in the last several years. And that is that people, I had this guy tell me when I was writing Dreamland, he said, which I found, you know, I want you to know, when I was writing Dreamland, I found 5 parents in the state of Ohio. The epicenter of the opioid epidemic, only 5 parents wanted to talk about this publicly for attribution in a book. Think about that. There's thousands and thousands of parents infected by this. One guy one of them said to me, he says, you have to remember, all across this country, there are people going to bed late at night, crying themselves to sleep, their arms around a photo album, terrified, lacerated by the death of a son, husband, grandfather, uncle, wife, you name it. Okay? Because it's all of that. Yeah. Lacerated by the death of this person and terrified that someone's going to find out how that person really died. Now, those people left that burden to come out of the shadows. And that is why we have discussions all across this country about medically assisted treatment. When I was writing Dreamland, there was none of that. Zero. I mean, there was a few, right, places where you talk about very little. That's why we have all these top discussions about, well, what do we do about jail? What do we do about all kinds of different things that are connected to this? We have a discussion, naloxone, unbelievable discussions about naloxone. When I was writing the book, nobody knew what it was. Barack Obama held a town hall meeting in West Virginia, didn't know how to pronounce the word. Why he's going, how do you pronounce that? He actually said, how do you pronounce that? I'm like,
did you say lick?
I'm sorry?
What did you say, lick? Did you say lick? Lick? Oh, no. Okay. I thought
so echoey.
It's another phrase.
No. So what I'm saying is that we have seen a revolution, not a total, but a very powerful change because people have seen the stories. They've heard the stories. The stories have been told to them. They know the stories in the workplace, in the churches, in the business, all in schools, et cetera. And you get, and frankly, I want to say too, I mean, if I don't defend myself, no one will, in my book too.
Yeah.
That was how people came to this new idea. And it is a transformation that has not happened, decades and decades thinking another way. And now within the last 10 years, boom. So tell your story every chance you get. Okay. Go ahead, Lauren. Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks. I was just really glad to. Hi, my name's Lauren. I'm a person in long-term recovery. Hi, Sam. Thanks for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I was glad to hear you bring up amphetamines because in college, I developed an addiction to ADHD medication.
Yeah, wow.
And I feel like that's something, that's pretty common and not really talked about much. And it became pretty bad to the point where I decided to go to my doctor and tell him I had ADHD. And I walked out of the room with a pretty large prescription very easily.
Yeah.
And so my question for you is what your thoughts are on how we prescribe in this country.
Yeah. So, that is the great story of the opioid epidemic, right? It's like, doc, I have this or that. And docs, by the time that I got onto the story, which was in, 2012, 13, doctors had already been stung because every time they would, and I had several who told me that they would say this, you don't need opioids. You need to work out, stop drinking, stop smoking, swim, walk. Eat better food, don't eat so many chicken nuggets on that kind of thing, right? Yeah. And that was all part of this problem. Now we've kind of rethought opioid prescribing, although the truth is opioids are magnificent drugs like fentanyl when used within their little box, their little window of how they should be used. They have a role. That role is not to be in every medicine cabinet in America. The same is true of ADHD. Now, I've thought this a long time, and I think part of it is what I talk about isolation, everyone in their houses. I remember when I was a kid, and I grew up in Southern California where the weather's always good. So from February to November, every day, literally every day after school, we were running around outside. Mm-hmm. We're at the park, bicycles, football, baseball, just running, playing with friends, right? Now I go back to that same street where I grew up. There's nobody. It's the cheapest housing in the town, which you would imagine would have lots of young kids. Nobody's on the street. Zero. It's a scary, ominous thing. The one time there were people on the street, so I go back there. It's about 40 miles from my house. So every time it takes me, I have something to do out there, swing by the old street and that kind of thing. And I'm mightily depressed by the time I leave because I see the park around the corner. Nobody's there. It's all just like empty, except for one time where I thought, okay, I'm going to film what it looks like on this street. Somebody saw me filming thought I was a child molester, begins to follow me, taking down my license and that kind of thing. But we moved to another house later on when I was older, and I babysat this poor dog next door. This poor dog, this couple had this big dog, heavy fur in the middle of Southern California. Anyway, what was really sad about it was they never, ever, ever took that dog for a walk. That dog remained cooped up. And so when there was a slightest opening in the gate, bam, trout, he would just take out. I mean, you'd have to spend 30 minutes on a bike running after him because he was dying to. I'm a boy, I'm a man, so I can tell you when I was a boy, boys are like dogs. They need to run all the damn time. It's true, but we have a culture where people are cooped up. They're 7, 8, 9, 10. They're going up the walls in elementary school, right? And so what do? Oh, it must be they need a pill. No, they need to get out and run every single day, you know? And to me, that's only extended when you get to college and, well, you can't focus. Oh, well, we got this new thing, you know, it's the drug companies figuring out a new problem we will need their drugs to solve. When in fact, as doctors can tell you very clearly, and many of them were saying this and then got pushed back on, just do the stuff that we evolved to do. Move, get up, eat the right food. Don't listen to, in our house, we do not have cable TV. It's just like heroin, that shit. So we don't have it. Okay. And so that kind of stuff, just get out and be among Americans. It's one of those great revelations I had as I traveled the country. Anyway, I get too preachy, I know, but anyway, that's kind of what I would say to what your question is. Thanks very much. Thank you, Lauren.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the main part of our program. We're going to, in a moment, we're going to break this down and bring up the book setup and the step and repeat so we can get some photos with the speakers. So Johann and Senator Rahm and Sam will join us up here. At this time, I'd like to bring up to close the day our President and CEO, Peter Espenshade.
Great. Thank you for joining us for a wonderful day. Just reflecting back on some of the things that we've heard very briefly, and then thinking about next steps. So what? What are we going to build off of together as a community off of these things? And some of the themes that we've been hearing, I think there's 3 main ones. The first is absolutely the least of us. That the act of helping just one person not only helps that person, it helps us build community. It is absolutely a win-win. And when you look at what happens here at Jenna's house, and how it has not only healed so many individuals, but how the town of Johnson itself takes great pride in this place. And just, I know Dawn was mentioning at their Halloween celebration, people from all over the town came and took pride in recovery and the fact that we can help each other. The second is trauma-informed care. I think we hear this time and time again. We heard it from Senator Rahm. We heard it from Johann. We've heard it from almost every thoughtful speaker we've heard over the past years. And we need to continue to integrate that into every act and every aspect of our practice. And then finally, I think the big theme that I heard, and again, I think every speaker touched on this, which is, personal responsibility does play a role, but it pales in comparison to, the algorithms of TikTok or synthetically manufactured drugs. Those forces are huge and stronger than any individual. But I noticed the speakers mentioned something that was stronger than that. And that is, we evolved as tribal primates. We were given a reward system that rewards love and care and community and being together. And I think there's great hope that that is what's going to carry the day, because before we as a species, discovered the opiate poppy, we discovered each other and we learned how to love and care for each other. And I think there is tremendous hope against some of these forces that are lined up against us. So what can we do? I think Johann said it really well. I think he said, in terms of advocacy, for example, there's no one thing that we should all be doing. We all have things that we're good at. We all have aspects of this care and this love that motivate us. And I know at least I'm motivated, and I know you all are too, to take what I love to do best, what motivates me, what animates me, and do that. And together, we're really going to be an army of love and of caring and to bringing ourselves back together as community. So really grateful for your work in the past, and I'm really grateful for your work coming up in the future. We've got a lot of good work together and great strengths we can build off of. So now over to Melissa.
All right, just a couple more things. First, I wanted to announce the winner of our virtual book giveaway. So all of you who entered that, the book is Johann Hari's new book, Stolen Focus, and the winner of that is Felicia, Missouri. And we are so, so grateful for all of you. This is a community that cares deeply, both for the people who you and we serve, and also for the people who serve. And speaking of service, I wanted to thank our staff at Recovery Vermont. So if you could please come up to the stage. And we have an honorary member of our staff, Olivia. Thank you for helping us this whole 6 weeks that we've been putting on this event. And lastly, we wanted to, as a staff, thank our fearless leader, Peter Espenshade, for his leadership, compassionate and generous care, and forward-thinking vision as president of Recovery Vermont for the past 9 years. You may have heard that Peter has recently announced his retirement, and we wanted to take this time to congratulate, honor, and thank him for the work he's done to transform and grow this organization. We're really, really lucky to have Peter over these last 9 years, and he has just brought so much joy and dedication and countless hours to this cause. He's written a multitude of successful grants and brought the necessary funding so our organization can keep growing and expanding. He's helped our organization navigate the murky waters of the pandemic, and had the vision to quickly pivot and move all of our in-person programs online. And we barely skipped a beat thanks to his energy, strategy, and leadership. Our team will miss his infectious enthusiasm, his love for linguistics, and his fashionable vintage wardrobe. And personally, Peter has not only been a mentor to me in the workplace, but he's been a real friend. He believed in me in a way that no other person on this earth has. And I just am going to be forever grateful for you, Peter. Thank you so much. So please come on up. We're going to quickly move the stage around and we're going to sell some books. We've got the meet and greet. We've got photos. So this concludes our event. Thank you so, so much. And we hope that you'll stick around and get some swag with us.